Valerie Pape was a glamorous divorcee.
She was blonde, she was petite, a very, very fashionable lady.
She had this beautiful French accent.
And she came to America hoping to put her failed marriage behind her.
She had some friends in Scottsdale, and she jumped on a plane to make a life here.
One that would be even more upscale and dazzling than what she left behind, thanks to Ira Pomerantz.
He was the playboy kind of guy.
He had airplanes, he had several Jaguars.
Their courtship was swift.
On their first date, he took her to Las Vegas.
But barely 4 years later, Ira would suddenly disappear.
I said, Valerie, listen, we need to put in a missing persons report.
Was the wealthy playboy on the run?
He was involved with bad people.
Did Valerie know more than she let on?
The delivery driver had seen something being put into the dumpster.
And would the missing man ever be found?
It was a torso. No arms, no legs, no head.
There's no dental. There's no way to identify the body.
Scottsdale, Arizona is a glitzy town of 200,000 just northeast of Phoenix.
It'd be like the Beverly Hills of Phoenix, I would say. Upper class, kind of shopping, art, restaurants, jewelry stores, and salons.
Scottsdale is the place where people want to live, the place where the movers and shakers live.
People like 60-year-old Ira Pomerantz, a successful businessman who enjoyed everything that life in Scottsdale had to offer.
He loved to play golf. He was a pilot. He had a plane. He loved people. He loved being around people. We were very, very close. We were good buddies.
Which is why Louis Milazzo was worried about Ira on the morning of January 26, 2000. The old friends hadn't spoken in almost a week, which was unusual.
I mean, I spoke to him 4 times a week, and I was concerned.
So concerned that Louis contacted Ira's wife, 47-year-old Valerie Pape.
I called Valerie. I said to her, "Where's Ira?" She said, "I don't know." And I said, "When was the last time you saw him?" She said, "I think I saw him late Sunday, but I don't know where he is. He didn't come home." And I said, "He didn't come home?" She said, "Yeah, he probably went to Las Vegas or something."
Ira would sometimes leave town without warning.
That's really how he had lived his entire life. Very spontaneous, always on a whim, taking off to Vegas, just doing things for himself.
Still, Louis wanted to make sure nothing had happened to his friend.
I said, "Valerie, listen, I think we need to put in a missing persons report."
Was Ira's friend simply overreacting? Was it possible he'd really gone to Vegas? Or was Louis right to think that something was wrong with Ira? Something bad enough to cut off all contact? The police would eventually find the answer, and Valerie would lead them to it. Born in 1952, Valerie started life far from Arizona, in a picturesque town in the French countryside.
She was the daughter of a French doctor, the person who really hadn't had to struggle a great deal in life, who was born with the silver spoon, essentially.
She was kind of prim and proper, brought up that way.
Growing up, she attended the best Catholic boarding school in the province.
She called it a white glove school in France, which meant they wore white gloves with their uniform.
After graduation, Valerie married well and moved to Paris.
She was married to a wealthy man, a certified public accountant. They lived in the Paris suburbs. They had 2 homes. She would take vacations to Italy, where she enjoyed winter sports. She was a lady of means.
And she was everything a sophisticated Parisian woman was supposed to be.
She was blonde. She was petite. She was a woman who would be noticed. A very, very fashionable lady.
She always had beautiful clothes on, designer clothes, designer bags. She always was dressed to the T's.
She was basically living the good life in France.
But there was one thing lacking in Valerie's life: children.
She'd always wanted a baby and could not conceive. And that always made her very unhappy because she wanted kids really bad.
Eventually, Valerie and her husband adopted a little girl.
She loved her daughter very much.
But just as it appeared that Valerie finally had it all, her life fell apart. She and her husband divorced, and the final settlement cost Valerie her daughter.
When her and the husband divorced, she lost custody completely, had no visitation rights.
Over 40 and suddenly alone, Valerie decided to start over in the United States.
She had some friends in Scottsdale. She jumped on a plane, I guess, and came over and tried to make a life here.
Once settled into Scottsdale, Valerie began taking cosmetology classes at the local community college.
She had this idea of opening a very prestigious salon in downtown Scottsdale.
And thanks to Ira Pomerantz, Valerie would realize her dream and more. "13 years older than Valerie, Ira wasn't from Arizona either.
He was from Monticello, New York, and then Brooklyn.
He'd been married and divorced twice, failed marriages that were largely Ira's fault, according to the youngest of his 2 daughters.
Marriage is probably the most difficult relationship there is. So if you're not willing to work at that relationship every day, it's going to fall apart. And my father being a free spirit and not wanting to be told where to be or what to do, I think he had issues.
However, even as Ira struggled in his personal life, his career flourished.
He was in the garment industry. He imported garments, sold the fabric to manufacturers.
Manufacturers like his old friend, Louis Milazzo.
We were in the same industry, and over time we became friends, and the relationship just grew.
And when Louis moved to Scottsdale in 1992, he convinced Ira to follow.
Louis told my dad it's much more kicked back and you can kind of semi-retire.
Ira was in his early 50s when he made the move to Scottsdale, but unlike Louis, he wasn't ready to retire just yet.
He went and started up some businesses, restaurant businesses, nightclub businesses.
Although owning nightclubs was more than just a business venture for Ira, it was also a chance to make the most of his midlife crisis.
He was a playboy kind of guy. Women were attracted to him. He was a good-looking man, and, he really didn't have a problem getting a date.
There were plane rides, there were fancy dinners, drive around in his Ferrari. He lived a lavish lifestyle.
However, it wasn't Ira's flashy car or playboy lifestyle that led him to Valerie. In 1994, as part of her cosmetology courses, Valerie volunteered to cut and style hair for residents at a Scottsdale assisted living facility. And one of her clients just happened to be Ira's elderly father, who'd moved to Scottsdale soon after his son.
Ira's father asked Valerie about her marital status, and when he discovered that she was single, he told her that I have a son who you have to meet.
The result was a whirlwind courtship.
On their first date, he took her to Las Vegas. She had never seen anything like it before, all the glitz and glamour of the strip.
Valerie, with her conservative Catholic upbringing and upper-middle-class Parisian background, had never met a playboy like Ira before.
He had a boyish charm about him.
It was a lot of fun to be around. Definitely like the life of the party.
And Ira was just as taken with Valerie.
And the way she spoke, she had this beautiful French accent. I think, it was alluring to him.
Within 6 months, Valerie had moved into Ira's condo, and within a year, he bought the couple a house in a fashionable Scottsdale neighborhood.
It's huge, 4,000 square foot home with a pool, and, it was everything for Valerie.
Her house was gorgeous. Persian rugs, a lot of wrought iron, very well decorated.
And soon after buying Valerie a home, Ira bought her an engagement ring.
They got married at the house.
The wedding, held before an intimate gathering of family and friends, was in November of 1995.
Ira, any last words here? so long. It was nice knowing you. Moving on to bigger and better things.
He's ready. You may now kiss the bride.
And soon after saying "I do," Ira helped Valerie achieve her dream of opening a salon, too, in Scottsdale's trendy Old Town.
It was, it was like in the heart of Scottsdale. It was a happening place.
He leased the place and did whatever they had to do to fix it up.
Although at the last minute, the salon almost failed to get off the ground.
She was supposed to open it with the girl from beauty school, and that fell through.
In need of a partner to help handle the workload and with few contacts in Scottsdale, Valerie turned to an old friend from France, a man named Michel.
They knew each other when they were children. She called him in France and said, "Come over, you have to help me." So he came over to own half the business with her.
With Michel's last-minute assistance, the salon opened as planned. And thanks to its upscale French flair, it was an instant success.
The salon was very popular. It was always busy when I was in there.
Besides hair, we had a lot of art and a lot of very boutique-y type clothing. We had a lot of parties in the atrium. We'd have a band, stuff like that.
And by the end of 1999, 2 years after Ira invested in her salon, Valerie had made a name for herself in Scottsdale.
She was well loved in the community.
But would she be able to hang on to her status and her salon after Ira suddenly disappeared? Coming up, a delivery driver makes a gruesome discovery.
It was a torso. No arms, no legs, no head.
But are the dismembered remains Ira's?
There are no prints. There's no dental. There's no way to identify the body.
It was January 26, 2000, when 47-year-old Valerie Pape walked into the Scottsdale, Arizona Police Department to report her husband, 60-year-old Ira Pomerantz, missing.
I called her and asked her to file the missing persons report, and I met Valerie at Scottsdale Police and filled out a missing persons report. She showed up and was in and out in 5 minutes, fill out the report, and she said, maybe you went to Vegas to have a good time.
And knowing Ira, Valerie may have had a point.
My father had a zest for fun and was more of a free spirit and wanted to come and go as he pleases.
However, Ira's friend Louis Milazzo and his daughters were still concerned. None of them had heard from Ira in almost a week.
Maybe your dad flew off to Vegas to have a good time, but that's maybe a couple of days worth of no calls, but not this is like the 5th day or 4th day or something. Like there's something wrong.
And that wasn't the only reason they were worried. According to friends, Valerie and Ira had always kept separate schedules.
He would work at night. See, he owned nightclubs. So he would start work at 2 in the afternoon and work till very late, where Valerie would be in bed at 10 o'clock. So they had separate lives. She was up and gone before Ira ever got up during the day.
And the distance between them only grew when Valerie opened her salon, especially once her friend and business partner Michel arrived from France.
He was a family friend from a long time. They knew each other when they were children. So he had come over to help her with the salon.
And in return, Valerie and Ira helped Michel make the transition to America.
He needed a place to live, and of course she insisted that he move in.
The house was big enough where he could have his own area.
It was an unusual arrangement, but it appeared to work.
They all connected, and my father seemed to like Michelle.
Plus, since Ira was always working late at his clubs, having Michelle around meant that Valerie had someone to escort her to the gallery openings, cocktail parties, and other events that the salon owner's socialite status demanded.
She liked to go out to nice restaurants. She liked to socialize with her friends. She liked to be involved and know what was going on with people.
The friend accompanied her to a lot of these things that Valerie liked to do.
In fact, Valerie and her friends spent so much time together at parties and events that Scottsdale's society gossip soon took notice.
It looked like to a lot of people out there that they were the couple.
According to his friend Louis Milazzo, it was starting to look that way to Ira, too.
Ira had told me, what kind of relationship am I having? She spends more time with him, and the relationship just became estranged at that point. He would say, I feel like an outsider in my own house now. As a matter of fact, he moved to a separate bedroom.
And according to Ira's attorney, that was only a preliminary step.
I am a certified family law divorce specialist in the state of Arizona. And he had discussed filing of an action to terminate the marriage.
He was saying that he might have made a mistake. And one way or the other, I just want to end this peacefully.
And according to Lewis, what Ira told him wasn't the only reason he was worried. It was when he'd told him to.
That's the last time I saw him. He was missing the next day.
But did that mean Ira had gone off to Vegas alone to put some distance between himself and Valerie before filing for divorce? Or was it possible things hadn't ended as peacefully as Ira intended? The next morning, less than 24 hours after Valerie and Lewis reported Ira missing, a driver was making an early delivery to a supermarket in Mesa, a Phoenix suburb just south of Scottsdale.
This was like 5 o'clock in the morning. It was very early in the morning in January. It would have been dark. And there was a delivery man, and he was parked behind this supermarket. Basically, he saw this woman pull up. He saw her get out of her Jaguar, and he saw her pop open the trunk and lift up a very heavy-looking object and throw it into the dumpster. And then, take off.
The whole thing looked suspicious to the delivery driver, but he had a schedule to keep.
He actually continued on his route, finished his route.
And it was only after finishing the day's deliveries and talking over his suspicions with another driver that he decided to find out if the mystery woman had really been up to something.
They both went back and checked the dumpster.
And they quickly found what the woman had left behind.
It was in a plastic bag, looked like a garbage bag, and it looked suspicious.
So suspicious that one of the delivery drivers decided that rather than open the bag, he'd poke it with a knife first.
It was an X-Acto knife, probably what he used to cut his packages open.
The blade went through the plastic easily, and when it came out, the driver's suspicions appeared to be confirmed.
He saw blood on the knife. That time, he, of course, figured that it was something that needed to be reported to the police. So he flagged down an officer that he saw in the area that happened to be driving through the area and asked him to come check it out.
And when the officer opened the garbage bag, he made a gruesome discovery.
It was a torso. And when I say torso, literally no arms, no legs, no head.
The head had been severed at the base of the neck. He had been cut at both shoulders, and his bottom half had been cut at the waist.
And his identity was a mystery.
When you find a torso from a criminal perspective, there are no prints, there's no dental, there's no way to identify a body. You can get a gender, and that's it. Unless the body contains visible scars, visible tattoos, something to match up with a missing persons report.
The police didn't have any easy way of finding out who the dead man was, but thanks to their witness, they might be able to identify the woman who disposed of the remains.
The delivery driver said that she appeared to be very slight, somewhere around 5 feet. He estimated her weighed at about 100 pounds, 105 pounds, somewhere along in there.
She was fashionably dressed, wearing a jumpsuit and high heels.
The quick-thinking delivery driver also provided a detailed description of the woman's car.
The car was a Jaguar, and he also got us the license plate, which he had written down.
So while the medical examiner's office began the grim task of removing the torso from the dumpster so that they could autopsy and hopefully identify the dead man, the investigators followed up on the only lead they had.
We ran the plate as a part of our investigation, and it came back to a woman named Valerie Pape.
Coming up, the investigators locate a possible crime scene.
The police found a bullet lodged in the wall.
But that's not the most gruesome find.
This would have been an excellent tool to use for the actual dismemberment.
By Friday, January 28, 2000, it had been 24 hours since police had found a man's dismembered torso in a dumpster outside a Mesa, Arizona grocery store.
We were alerted by a citizen, actually it was a delivery driver, who said that he had seen something being put into the dumpster by a lady when he was making a delivery.
And the witness's tip led the police to Valerie Pape's salon in Scottsdale's Tony Old Town neighborhood.
The delivery man wrote down the plate, gave it to the police, and that's why they arrested Valerie.
They got her about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know if she was done for the day or in the middle of a haircut, but they came and arrested her.
Not only had a witness placed the 47-year-old at the scene of the crime, Valerie had reported her husband, 60-year-old Ira Pomerantz, missing less than 24 hours before the witness spotted her, throwing what turned out to be a man's dismembered body into the dumpster. But did that mean the body was her husband? The missing persons investigators had already uncovered trouble in Valerie and Ira's marriage.
They were estranged, and we thought that she had a lover.
But for the moment, the police had no way of identifying the dismembered torso.
We didn't have any fingerprints or any facial features or things like that.
Confirming the body's identity would have to wait on an autopsy and DNA tests. But since she'd allegedly been seen dumping the body, the investigators had more than enough probable cause to question Valerie.
We contacted Valerie to try and establish if she would, at least admit that she was in the area, which would give us a starting point for the investigation.
At first, Valerie tried to deny that she was the one who dumped the torso.
We never believed her from the beginning, based on the witness account that they had seen a woman dumping the torso.
And when the investigators made it clear that she'd basically been caught red-handed, Valerie's story suddenly changed.
What she discloses is that she came home and the body was there.
She had found her husband on January 24th, that she had came home in the morning, found her husband in a pool of blood, laying face up on the kitchen floor.
But if that were true, if she had come home to find Ira dead on the kitchen floor, why not call 911?
She said that she did not call the police because she was afraid.
She was afraid that she'd be accused, and she did what she did because she thought she was protecting herself.
And according to Valerie, that fear led her to tell her husband's friend Louis Milazzo that Ira had probably gone to Vegas and to file a missing persons report.
All of those things are just so far-fetched. I mean, you look at her, you look at the body, you look at the circumstances involved, and you say, come on. I mean, really?
Because what was more incriminating, finding your husband dead or getting caught dumping his dismembered body?
She clammed up when it came to talking about the dismemberment. She lawyered up, and so they had to end the interview right there.
However, she was adamant about one thing.
She denied responsibility for the murder completely.
Not that her denials made any impression on the investigators, who proceeded to book Valerie into the Maricopa County Jail.
She was charged with first-degree murder.
It all clued in. They were in the middle of a divorce, so there was a lot of, anger and resentment between the two of them.
But while the investigators suspected the dismembered torso was Ira's, could they prove it? A few days after Valerie's arrest, the autopsy provided the answer.
They just took our DNA with swabs, and then they told us we all matched, and it was our dad, and that was just devastating news.
It all felt very surreal, like this only happens in a movie.
The torso's identity wasn't all that the autopsy revealed, however.
Striations that they saw on the body indicated to them that they thought the body had been killed earlier and had been frozen.
And while Ira's head had been severed at the neck, there were traces of a gunshot wound just below the cut.
He had been killed by a gunshot to the back of the neck.
They theorized that the bullet had gone into his head by the trajectory of the wound.
But where was the rest of Ira's body?
If she had been doing what we anticipated, she was driving from dumpster to dumpster, it would have been impossible to find a body at that point in time. given all of the pickups and the large area of the city she could have covered.
Which meant the investigators were extremely fortunate that any of Ira's body had been found.
The person who saw her putting it in the dumpsters, had he not been there, had he not seen that, we may not have even discovered the torso in the trash bin prior to it being taken away and dumped.
Without a body, it's very hard to prosecute a murder.
But could the police find the murder weapon? In the days following Valerie's arrest, the Mesa and Scottsdale police served a search warrant on the couple's Scottsdale home.
Apparently there were guns all throughout the house.
That wasn't the only place they found guns either.
The police found a gun hidden in the back seat of the Jaguar.
But was the gun from Valerie's car or any of the guns found in the house the murder weapon? Since no bullets had been recovered from Ira's body, it was difficult to say, although the investigators did have one tantalizing clue.
During the investigation, the police found a bullet that was lodged in the wall of the home.
The bullet wasn't just in any wall either. It was in the kitchen, exactly where Valerie claimed she'd discovered Ira's dead body, leading the police to believe they'd found the crime scene.
They believed that the bullet that they recovered from the kitchen was fired from the gun that they found in Valerie Pape's car.
The gun and the bullet both went to the crime lab for ballistics testing, but they weren't the only intriguing pieces of evidence that the search warrant produced.
They had found receipts for a reciprocating saw.
This would have been an excellent tool to use for the actual dismemberment.
The police never found the saw, but she had bought it with her credit card. And according to the date on the receipt, she bought it before Ira's murder.
If you look at the fact that she bought the reciprocating saw a month before the body was dismembered, that seems to imply some premeditation.
Dismemberment seemed like the only way she could have gotten Ira's body out of the house, too.
Ira was probably 5'10", 5'11", probably close to 200 pounds. Valerie was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, 100 pounds tops.
And even Ira's dismembered torso alone had almost been more than Valerie could handle.
The eyewitness said it was a big struggle for her just to get it out of the car.
Which left the investigators pondering one more possibility.
So we believe to remove it from the house, she had to have someone helping her.
There's no way she could have done this on her own.
And as far as the investigators were concerned, there was one obvious suspect.
She had this friend, Michelle, who was conveniently staying with her.
We believe that they had a relationship past being friends, and that was one of the reasons why we thought that she committed the murder to begin with.
But had Valerie's friend been more than a possible motive for killing Ira?
The police thought he may have helped her out with at least the dismemberment.
But while the police suspected it, proving it was an entirely different story.
There was no hard evidence that there was a accomplice involved.
However, when the ballistics test on the bullet embedded in her kitchen wall came back from the crime lab, the evidence against Valerie kept piling up.
They concluded that it had been fired from a gun that was found in her car.
The ballistic evidence, the reciprocating saw, and the body in the dumpster. Taken together, it was more than enough for the grand jury.
The grand jury comes down with a first-degree murder indictment.
But since the prosecutors couldn't prove that the bullet in the wall was the one that killed Ira, would it be enough for a conviction?
This is all circumstantial evidence because there was no witness.
Coming up, the investigators dig into Valerie and Ira's finances.
Some of his business dealings had went south.
And that leads them to wonder, had the Vegas high roller gotten in over his head in a desperate attempt to keep afloat?
He was involved with bad people. He owed him money.
"48-year-old Valerie Pape sat in Arizona's Maricopa County Jail, held without bond while awaiting trial for the murder of her husband, Ira Pomerantz.
From a prosecutor's side, She was a French citizen. She had committed first-degree murder. It gave her every reason in the world to flee. So the court decided that she was non-bondable.
But was there another way Valerie could get out of jail, or at least out of an American jail? Valerie's friend Michelle, after being cleared of any involvement in Ira's murder, brought her case to the attention of the French consulate's office, who took an immediate interest.
First-degree murder could have put death penalty on the table.
And since France had outlawed the death penalty, that could have caused an international incident if the prosecutors pushed for it.
The decision that was made was, okay, we're not going to seek the death penalty. We're going to go for first-degree murder without the death penalty, which means life in prison if convicted.
It was a bitter disappointment for Ira's daughter, Stacy.
I was very upset about that because as far as I could see, they have enough of the criteria to seek the death penalty. I thought they met that criteria easily.
Although for the prosecutors, their first priority was securing a conviction, and they felt they had a strong case against Valerie.
At that point in time, the prosecution's case was planned, and evidence of that planning was obviously the purchase of a saw weeks before the murder.
But as Valerie's trial date approached, would new evidence put the prosecution's case in jeopardy? At the time of Valerie's arrest, what motivated the murder had appeared obvious.
Ira's family thought that Valerie was a gold digger, that the only reason that she was with their dad was because of the fact that he had money.
And the police suspected that she had killed Ira because the couple was heading for a divorce.
If they were still married when he was dead, she stood to have his money.
That's what the investigators and prosecutors believed. But when they looked into Ira's finances, they made a surprising discovery.
Ira had filed for bankruptcy. Some of his business dealings had went south. And there's no question that there was some financial duress going on in the home.
In fact, while preparing for trial, Valerie's defense team and supporters hinted that Ira, who'd made his fortune in New York's garment trade and made regular trips to Vegas, might have gotten in over his head trying to stave off bankruptcy.
He was involved with bad people, is what I think was the problem. He owed him money.
Was it possible Valerie was telling the truth, that someone else had killed Ira?
She said that she had found him dead in the kitchen. She did not say that she shot him. She said she found him dead.
But even as Valerie claimed she had nothing to do with his murder, she made a shocking accusation about her late husband.
Valerie had reported that there was domestic violence going on in the home.
Ira's family was outraged.
I was reading this article, one of the first articles that hit the paper, specifically the part where Valerie states that she was the victim of domestic abuse. I was just like, what?
In all the years that I knew Ira, the one thing he wasn't was violent. He just wasn't violent at all.
But while Ira's family and friends dismissed the claim, Valerie's accusation did win her considerable sympathy in the community.
Valerie had a lot of friends in Scottsdale. She was very well liked. She hung out with all the right people. And so she had her group of cheerleaders. Ira had been a longtime businessman here in Arizona, and so he had his following. And so there was a huge dispute over whether or not she actually was a victim of domestic violence.
And some of Valerie's friends said they had seen the evidence.
There was a day that Valerie came into work kind of upset. And I said, what's wrong? And she goes, look, I have bruises. And she lifted up her skirt way up high. She had a short skirt on. And she showed me the bruises. And I said, that's crazy. That's not right.
Thanks to the defense, pictures of a bruised and battered Valerie even made it into the local paper.
They showed this picture with her having 2 black eyes.
But was the picture really evidence of abuse? Or was it simply a calculated piece of character assassination on the part of Valerie's supporters? According to his daughter, the photograph had nothing to do with domestic violence.
I saw the dates that she said this was from. I called right away and told the newspaper, I don't believe that the domestic abuse was the cause of these black eyes, but rather the facelift that she had the day before that picture was taken. I gave them the information that they needed to check it out, and they retracted the whole domestic abuse thing.
But did Ira's daughter know the whole truth about her father? The bogus facelift picture wasn't all that the defense had.
There are records of, the police showing up to the house for various reasons.
Most of the calls were for domestic disturbances.
The scenario with Valerie, she would instigate an argument and, there would be yelling and there'd be shouting and fighting and two people in an argument. But I don't think it would have gone physical.
He never hit us. And, never hit my mom, never hit his second wife, and never was violent with Valerie either.
That's what Ira's daughters claimed. But Valerie's attorneys also had documents suggesting that what was going on was more than just a shouting match.
Valerie had taken out an order of protection against Ira.
The protection order dated to 1999.
It was well before the murder, which was verified by the police department. But there were no other police reports reference any sort of abuse.
Still, the order of protection, the couple's history of domestic disturbances, and Valerie's claims of abuse were enough to give the prosecutors pause.
Domestic violence might have been a stumbling point. You could see why a jury would not find first-degree murder.
If the jury comes back not guilty, it's not guilty. She walks, she goes free, and there's no justice for the victim.
So in the summer of 2002, the prosecutors decided to offer Valerie a deal.
They were going to plea it out to second-degree murder.
The plea agreement terms allow her to be sentenced for anywhere between 10 and 16 years in prison.
Considering what Valerie had done to Ira, his family didn't think 16 years was nearly enough, but they resigned themselves to the deal.
The DA's office and was really pushing this, saying, there's no guarantees with a trial. It could go either way, and it's a big crapshoot. And I was just like,
Would Valerie take the deal, or would she risk going to trial? In the end, she ran into the same dilemma that dogged the prosecutors.
You have one shot at a trial. That's it. You have one shot.
So rather than risk going to prison for life, Valerie Pape appeared in Maricopa County Superior Court on August 20th, 2002, and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder.
It took almost 3 years from the time of her arrest until the time that she pled guilty.
It was a shocking reversal, considering Valerie had always proclaimed her innocence, a stance she strangely tried to maintain, even while pleading guilty to murder.
Her words were that she fired a gun in the direction of Ira Pomerantz and hit him. And I'd never heard wording like that, and it sort of like took a little bit of the culpability away from her. It seemed to me, at least, that she wasn't fully admitting to it.
There was no remorse or taking responsibility for what happened. I think, she took the plea because she was going to get something, and that was the shortest jail sentence she could get.
And then, when Ira's daughter made her own plea to Valerie during her victim's impact statement to the court, Valerie had even less to say.
I turned around to her directly, and I'm like, just tell us where the rest of his body is so we can bury him whole, And she just looked at me dumbly and blankly and didn't say anything.
It may have been a mistake.
The judge was not too happy that she never said where the rest of the body was.
And his displeasure may have been reflected in Valerie's sentence.
The judge gave her the harshest he could give. She ended up getting sentenced to 16 years.
Coming up, will a guilty plea be enough to keep Valerie in prison?
The U.S. and other countries have these treaties where they exchange prisoners.
They were very, very worried that France would release her on parole.
To the murder of her husband, Ira Pomerantz, a plea that surprised her friends and supporters.
She had to snap or have some kind of a breakdown to do what she did, because that's not the Valerie that I knew and loved at all.
She's a very wonderful person and was a very good friend to me. So it would be hard for me to think of her doing anything that would hurt a human being.
In prison for second-degree murder, the 54-year-old had almost 10 years remaining on her 16-year sentence.
She was given credit for, the nearly 3 years she spent in the county jail.
But would Valerie, who was a French citizen, stay in an American prison?
In 2006, there was an effort to have Valerie transferred to France to serve out the rest of her sentence.
The U.S. and other countries have these treaties where they exchange prisoners.
That didn't make the transfer any less of a surprise to Ira's family, though.
When Ira Pomerantz's daughters heard about this, they just were aghast.
I was like, oh my God, the courts here have no say-so over what they do with the prisons there.
They were very, very worried that France would release her on parole.
I was on the phone immediately. Like, I'm like, call them, tell them, no, wait, don't let them do this, don't let them do this.
We found out about it like in the nick of time, and she was already en route back to France.
The state of Arizona had basically signed off on this, and she had been transferred to a federal holding facility.
But once the Arizona authorities found out that the family objected, the transfer came to a halt.
She was returned to Arizona and served out the rest of her sentence.
Although at the age of 62, Valerie finally did go home.
So Valerie completed her sentence in February 2016, and she was deported back to France. And apparently that's where she's living now.
I don't know what she's doing in France now. I really try not to think much about her. It's disappointing. I know this is our legal system, but, in this situation, my father being murdered, I don't feel there was true justice for what happened to him.
There are murders that remain in the memory of a city because of their brutality. There are others that become famous because of the person who committed them. And then there are cases that grow into something larger than the crime itself. Cases that become stories people repeat for decades. Stories that eventually begin to obscure the human beings at the center of them. The murder of Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese is one of those cases. On the surface, it was a horrifying killing in Queens, New York, in the early hours of March 13th. 1964. A 28-year-old woman was followed as she made her way home, attacked by a stranger, and fatally wounded. Her killer, Winston Mosley, would later confess not only to her murder, but to other violent crimes. Yet the case became famous for another reason. Within weeks, a newspaper account transformed the murder into a story about 38 supposed witnesses who had seen a woman being killed and failed to help her. The image was unforgettable. A woman crying for assistance in the darkness, while people supposedly watched from their windows and did nothing. It seemed to reveal something terrifying about modern city life. How could so many people hear a woman in danger and simply turn away? The story entered American culture, psychology, journalism, and public memory. But there was a problem. The story was not as simple as it appeared. Decades later, researchers and journalists would re-examine what actually happened that night and discover that the famous account had seriously exaggerated what the residents of Kew Gardens had seen and understood. There was no evidence that 38 people stood at their windows and watched the entire murder. Some people heard screams. Some became aware that something was happening without understanding exactly what it was. Many apartments did not have a direct view of the location where the attack occurred. And some people did attempt to obtain help. The tragedy was real. The famous version of the tragedy was something else. To understand what happened, it is necessary to return to the beginning, not to the newspaper headline, not to the psychological studies that followed, and not to the legend that eventually surrounded Kitty's name, but to a quiet neighborhood in Queens and an ordinary woman trying to get home. Kitty Genovese was 28 years old in March 1964. She lived in Kew Gardens, Queens, an area regarded as a relatively peaceful residential community. She worked at a bar in Queens, and on the night of March 13th, she finished her shift at approximately 2:30 in the morning. At that hour, the city was different from the one people imagined during the daylight. Streets were quieter. Most residents were asleep behind the doors and windows of nearby apartments. Kitty got into a red Fiat and began the journey home. There was nothing about that journey that suggested it would be her last. She was not walking toward a known enemy. She was not involved in an argument. She was not knowingly entering a dangerous situation. She was simply going home after work. Around 3:15 a.m., she parked near the Kew Garden station and began walking toward her apartment. Somewhere in that darkness, however, another person had noticed her. His name was Winston Moseley. Moseley was 29 years old, married, and a father. From the outside, he did not necessarily appear to be the kind of man who would become responsible for a killing that would later be remembered across the United States. But beneath that ordinary appearance were violent and dangerous tendencies. Later investigations would reveal that he had committed burglaries and attacks against women. On this night, according to his own account, Moseley was looking for a woman to attack. Kitty became his target after he noticed her. That fact is critical. This was not simply a confrontation that unexpectedly became violent. Moseley deliberately selected Kitty. He followed her as she made her way home. Kitty had no reason to know what was happening behind her. She was moving toward a place she believed was safe, toward the building where she lived, toward the end of an ordinary work night. Instead, she was being followed by a stranger carrying a hunting knife. The attack began as Kitty approached her neighborhood. When she realized that someone was coming after her, she tried to escape. Moseley pursued her and caught up with her. He stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty cried out for help. Her cries mattered because they were heard. Some people in the surrounding apartments became aware that something was happening. One neighbor opened a window and shouted toward Moseley, telling him to leave the woman alone. For a moment, the attack stopped. Moseley ran away. From the perspective of anyone who heard or saw only this part of the incident, it might have appeared that the danger had passed. A stranger had been confronted. The attacker had fled. The woman was still alive. But that was not the end. Kitty had been badly injured, yet she continued trying to move towards safety. She made her way toward the area behind the building, toward an entrance or vestibule near the Long Island Railroad tracks. That location would later become an important part of understanding the case because it was less visible from the surrounding apartments. The first part of the attack and the later part of the attack did not unfold in the same way or in the same place. Moseley returned. He had not abandoned his target. He found Kitty again and attacked her for the second time. The violence continued until she was left with multiple knife wounds and defensive injuries. The details are difficult to absorb, but the essential fact is simple. Kitty had survived the first assault long enough to try to reach safety, only for the attacker to return and continue the attack. Eventually, someone came to her. Sophia Farrar, who lived nearby, went to Kitty after learning what had happened. Kitty was gravely wounded. Farrar stayed with her and called for help. She remained there until emergency personnel arrived. Kitty's injuries were too severe. She died on March 13, 1964, at the age of 28. The murder should have been remembered first and foremost as the killing of a young woman who was followed, attacked, and fatally wounded on her way home. Instead, something happened in the weeks that followed that would change the way millions of people understood the case. On March 27, 1964, the New York Times published an article with the headline, "37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police." The article presented a disturbing picture of residents who supposedly knew what was happening and failed to intervene. The number associated with the story would become 38. The image was powerful precisely because it seemed to turn Kitty's murder into a judgment on everyone around her. The killer was Winston Moseley, but the public story seemed to suggest that the neighborhood itself had also failed Kitty. The idea was horrifying. Dozens of ordinary people supposedly watched or listened as a woman was attacked. Yet nobody acted decisively. The story appeared to reveal something fundamental about human behavior. Perhaps people in cities had become detached from one another. Perhaps fear prevented them from helping. Perhaps when too many people witnessed an emergency, each person assumed someone else would act. These questions would later become deeply connected to psychological research into what became known as the bystander effect. But the foundation of that discussion was a story that did not accurately represent everything that happened that night. The later examination of the case revealed a much more complicated reality. There were people who heard screams without understanding their meaning. There were people who did not have a clear view of the attack. The second phase of the violence occurred in an area hidden from many apartments. And there were people who attempted to get help. The number 38 did not mean what generations of Americans came to believe it meant. That distinction does not make Kitty's death less tragic. If anything, it makes the story more human. Instead of a simple tale about dozens of cold observers, there was a confusing, frightening event unfolding in darkness, perceived differently by different people, followed by a newspaper narrative that gave the public a single, unforgettable explanation. To tell Kitty Genovese's story accurately, we therefore have to hold two truths at the same time. First, a young woman was brutally murdered after being deliberately targeted by a dangerous man. Second, the story that later surrounded her murder was shaped by an account that greatly simplified what the witnesses actually saw and understood. The woman was real. The fear was real. The bloodshed was real. But the legend was not the whole truth. And before we examine the investigation, the confession, the courtroom, and the man who would spend more than 5 decades behind bars, we need to remember where this story began. It began not with 38 witnesses, not with a psychological experiment, and not with a famous newspaper headline. It began with Kitty Genovese leaving work in the early hours of March 13th, driving home through Queens, parking near Kew Garden Station, and walking toward the place where she expected to be safe. Somewhere nearby, Winston Moseley had already noticed her. He had chosen her. And in the darkness of that quiet neighborhood, Kitty's ordinary journey home became the beginning of one of the most misunderstood murder stories in American history. Before Kitty Genovese became a name associated with the phrase 38 witnesses, she was simply a young woman living an ordinary life in Queens. That distinction is important because the mythology surrounding her death has often been so powerful that the person herself can disappear behind the story. For decades, many people who knew the case knew Kitty primarily as a symbol, the woman who was supposedly attacked while an entire neighborhood watched. But Kitty was not a symbol on the night of March 13th, 1964. She was 28 years old, she had a job, she had a home, and she was making her way back to that home after finishing another shift. Her life was not defined by the final minutes of it. Yet those minutes would eventually become one of the most discussed episodes in American criminal history. Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese was born in 1935. By the time she reached her late 20s, she was living in Kew Gardens, Queens, New York. Kew Gardens was a relatively peaceful residential community, a place where people lived close to one another and where apartment buildings and streets created a sense of a neighborhood rather than an isolated landscape. Kitty lived there with her friend Mary and Zelanko. Their home was part of the ordinary structure of her life, a place she could return to after work and leave again the next day. There was nothing about the neighborhood that suggested Kitty was walking into a place where she should expect to be hunted. That is one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The danger did not announce itself. There was no known confrontation waiting for her, no warning that a stranger had selected her as a target. Kitty's final evening began like many other evenings. She worked at a bar in Queens. Her shift ended at approximately 2:30 in the morning. At that point, the city around her was deep into the night. She left work, got into her red Fiat, and began driving home. There is something almost painfully ordinary about that sequence. Finish work, get into the car, drive home, park, walk inside, It is a routine repeated by countless people every night. For Kitty, however, the routine would end differently. Around 3:15 a.m., she parked near the Kew Garden station. From there, she began walking toward her apartment. The distance between where she parked and where she lived represented the final ordinary stage of her journey. She was moving toward a familiar place, toward a home shared with someone she knew, and toward the end of a night of work. She did not know that Winston Mosley had noticed her. Mosley was 29 years old, only a year older than Kitty. He was married and had children. Nothing in the basic description of his life necessarily suggested to a stranger that he was capable of the violence that would soon follow. But the later investigation would reveal another side of him. Mosley had dangerous sexual and violent tendencies, and investigators would eventually learn that he had been involved in burglaries and attacks against women. On the night Kitty encountered him, he was not simply another person traveling through the neighborhood. According to his later account, he was looking for a woman to attack. Kitty became his target after he noticed her. This changes the meaning of everything that followed. It means the encounter was not simply an argument between two strangers that suddenly became violent. Kitty did not provoke a confrontation. She was selected. Mosley followed her. Somewhere between the parking area and her home, the ordinary rhythm of Kitty's journey was interrupted by the presence of a man she did not know. She became aware that someone was approaching her. When the threat became apparent, she tried to escape. She ran, but Mosley pursued her. He caught up with her and stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty cried out for help. Those cries became one of the most important elements in the story that followed, because they connected the private horror of the attack with the surrounding neighborhood. People nearby became aware that something was happening, but awareness was not the same thing as understanding. That distinction would become essential decades later, when the original account of the case was reconsidered. At least one neighbor opened a window and shouted at Mosley, telling him to leave the woman alone. The reaction was enough to make him retreat. He ran away, and for anyone who had perceived only that portion of the incident, the immediate danger might have appeared to be over. A woman had cried out. A man had been confronted. The man had fled. The situation seemed to have ended. But Kitty was still injured, and Mosley had not truly abandoned the attack. Kitty tried to move towards safety. Wounded and frightened, she made her way toward the area behind the building, toward an entrance or vestibule near the Long Island Railroad tracks. This location would later matter greatly because it was less visible from many of the surrounding apartments. The physical layout of the area meant that people who had heard something earlier could not necessarily see what happened next. The story of the 38 witnesses would later make it sound as though dozens of people had a clear view of the entire murder. The reality described in the available information is much more complicated. The second stage of the attack occurred in a location that was largely hidden from the view of nearby residents. Mosley returned. He found Kitty again and attacked her a second time. She suffered multiple knife wounds, as well as defensive injuries that indicated she had attempted to protect herself. The fact that Kitty tried to survive matters. The story should not begin and end with the idea of a helpless victim lying unnoticed while the world looked away. She was attacked, she attempted to escape, and after the first assault she continued moving, trying to reach somewhere safer. But the danger followed her. Mosley returned, and the violence continued. Eventually, Kitty was found by Sophia Farrar, who lived nearby. Farrar went to her after learning what had happened. By then, Kitty was gravely wounded. Farrar stayed with her and asked that help be summoned. She remained beside Kitty until emergency personnel arrived. This detail is easily lost when the case is reduced to the famous headline. The popular image suggests a woman dying completely alone while an entire neighborhood remained indifferent. But Kitty was not entirely alone at the end. Someone came to her. Someone stayed with her. Someone sought help. These facts do not erase the horror of the murder. nor do they explain every reaction of every person who heard something that night. But they do remind us that the reality was more complicated than the legend. Kitty's injuries were too severe. She died on March 13, 1964, at only 28 years of age. In a matter of minutes, the life of a woman who had been working, driving home, and walking toward her apartment was transformed into a crime scene. The people who knew her would never see her return from that night. Mary and Zelonko would lose her friend and roommate, and the neighborhood of Kew Gardens would become associated with a murder that would soon attract attention far beyond Queens. Yet the most important thing to understand about Kitty before continuing into the investigation is that her story did not begin with her death. She had existed before the crime, and she had a life outside the circumstances that ended it. She worked, she drove, she lived with a friend, she had a familiar route home. She was part of a community. These details may seem simple, but they are precisely what gets lost when a victim becomes an icon. In the weeks after her death, the public would hear a very different version of what had happened. The story would focus heavily on the people surrounding Kitty rather than on Kitty herself. It would ask what the neighbors had seen, what they had heard, and why they had apparently failed to act. Eventually, the number 38 would become inseparable from her name. But before that number existed, there was only the reality of one woman walking home. She did not know Winston Moseley was watching her. She did not know he was searching for a victim. She did not know that he had chosen her. And she could not have known that the circumstances of her death would eventually become the foundation for one of the most famous discussions about human behavior in modern American history. Kitty Genovese was 28 years old when her life ended. The story that followed would last much longer. But the story should always begin with the woman, not the myth. Kitty leaving work in the early morning darkness, driving her red Fiat toward Kew Gardens, parking near the station, and walking toward home, unaware that a stranger had already made a decision that would change everything. By the time Kitty Genovese began walking from the area near Kew Gardens Station toward her apartment, the night had already become quiet. It was around 3:15 in the morning on March 13, 1964. Kitty had finished work at approximately 2:30 a.m., driven her red Fiat home, parked near the station, and started the final part of her journey on foot. She was 28 years old, and nothing about the beginning of those minutes suggested that she was walking into a confrontation. She was simply returning home, but Winston Moseley had noticed her. He was 29, married, and a father. Yet he was also a man with dangerous sexual and violent tendencies. According to his later account, he had been looking for a woman to attack. Kitty became the woman he selected. That decision is the starting point for understanding what happened next. This was not a disagreement that suddenly turned violent, and it was not a random collision between two strangers. Moseley deliberately followed Kitty. Somewhere in the darkness of Kew Gardens, she became aware that a man was approaching her. She tried to escape. Moseley pursued her. The distance between them disappeared quickly, and he caught her. He was carrying a hunting knife. He stabbed Kitty twice in the back. The attack was sudden, frightening, and severe. Kitty cried out for help. Her voice carried into the surrounding residential area, and people nearby became aware that something was happening. But what those people understood, and what they could actually see, would later become one of the most disputed and misunderstood elements of the case. At least one neighbor reacted directly. A window opened, and the neighbor shouted toward Moseley, telling him to leave the woman alone. The interruption had an immediate effect. Moseley stopped and ran away. From a distance, it could have looked as though the danger had ended. An attacker had fled. A woman had been assaulted, but she was still alive. Someone had shouted. Perhaps the crisis was over. But Kitty had been seriously wounded, and the man who attacked her had not actually given up. The momentary retreat created a terrible illusion of safety. Kitty was left injured, but she continued moving. She tried to reach somewhere safer. She made her way toward the area behind the building, toward an entrance or vestibule near the Long Island Railroad tracks. The geography of the location would later become extremely important. The second part of the attack occurred in an area that was less visible from many of the surrounding apartments. This matters because the later public story would suggest that dozens of people had a clear view of Kitty's entire ordeal. The available evidence does not support that image. Some residents heard screams. Some became aware of an unusual disturbance. But hearing a cry in the darkness is not the same as seeing an entire attack. And seeing part of an incident is not the same as understanding that someone is being murdered. Kitty continued trying to get away. She had already been attacked once, and she was injured. Yet she did not simply remain where she had fallen. She moved toward safety. Behind the building, near the entrance and the railroad tracks. She was eventually found again by Mosley. He had returned. The man who had initially fled after being confronted had come back to continue what he had started. Mosley attacked Kitty for the second time. The violence continued until she suffered multiple knife wounds. She also sustained defensive injuries, indicating that she had attempted to protect herself. The second attack is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case because it demonstrates that the first interruption had not ended the danger. Kitty had survived the initial assault and tried to move away, but Mosley followed her again. The attack was not a single burst of violence followed by immediate escape. It continued after a temporary retreat. The precise details of every second that passed are not contained in the information available here, and they should not be invented. What can be stated is that Kitty suffered severe injuries, that the attack occurred in a comparatively concealed location, and that Mosley ultimately left her gravely wounded. The events that followed also complicate the image that later became attached to her death. Kitty was not simply abandoned in complete isolation. Sophia Farrar, who lived nearby, went to Kitty after learning what had happened. Farrar found her seriously injured and stayed with her. She asked that help be called and remained beside Kitty until emergency personnel arrived. This detail is important because it stands against one of the most persistent assumptions created by the later newspaper account. The idea that nobody came. Someone did come. Someone stayed. Someone sought help. That does not mean that everyone who heard something responded appropriately, nor does it erase the questions surrounding the reactions of other residents. But it means that the reality of that night cannot honestly be reduced to a single sentence about an entire neighborhood watching silently. Kitty was eventually taken for emergency care, but her injuries were too serious. She died on March 13, 1964, at 28 years old. Her death ended the immediate physical struggle, but it was only the beginning of a very different kind of story. In the hours and days afterward, investigators would have to reconstruct what had happened in the darkness. They would need to determine how Kitty had been attacked, where the attacker had come from, how he had escaped, and whether anyone had seen something that could identify him. At first, the case had no obvious answer. There was no known relationship between Kitty and her killer. There was no established motive connecting them. Mosley was a stranger who had selected her because she happened to become the target of his search for a woman to attack. The police would begin interviewing residents around the area, trying to separate useful observations from uncertainty. Some people had heard screams. Some had perceived part of the disturbance. Some had remembered a vehicle. But the scene did not offer the simple clarity that the later legend would suggest. There had not been a crowd standing together with a complete view of the crime. There were separate apartments, separate perspectives, and people who understood only fragments of what was happening. The physical layout mattered as much as human perception. The first attack had taken place in an area where cries could be heard. The second occurred farther from direct view, behind the building and near the railroad tracks. A person who heard the first cries might reasonably have believed the situation had ended when the attacker ran away. A person who saw the attacker flee might not have known that he would return. A person who later heard something else might not have understood that it was connected to the earlier disturbance. These distinctions would become critical when the story reached the newspapers. But before the newspaper story, there was a police investigation. And before the investigation produced a suspect, there was uncertainty. Kitty was dead. Her killer was still free. And somewhere in New York, Winston Moseley continued his life without the people around him knowing what he had done. The investigation would eventually reveal that his crimes did not begin with Kitty and did not end with her. But at this moment, the police did not yet have the full picture. They had a murder in Kew Gardens, a victim who had been deliberately targeted, witnesses with incomplete observations, and a dangerous offender who had disappeared into the city. Kitty's final journey had begun as an ordinary trip home. It had ended with a violent attack, an attempted escape, a second assault, and fatal injuries. Yet the most enduring question would not initially be about the killer. It would be about everyone else. What had the people nearby actually heard? What had they actually seen? And why, in the weeks that followed, would the public come to believe that dozens of people had watched a murder and done nothing? To answer those questions, the story must move from the dark streets of Kew Gardens to the investigation that followed, and eventually to the newspaper account that transformed Kitty Genovese from a murder victim into one of the most famous names in the history of American crime. The murder of Kitty Genovese should have been remembered as a terrible crime committed against a 28-year-old woman on her way home. Instead, within weeks, it became something much larger. The crime itself was transformed into a story about the people who lived around it, a story about neighbors, windows, screams, silence, and an astonishing number, 38. That number would become inseparable from Kitty Genovese's name. It would be repeated in newspapers, discussed by psychologists, remembered in classrooms, and used for decades as an example of what could happen when people witnessed an emergency and assumed that someone else would act. But to understand how that story developed, we have to slow down and examine what the residents of Kew Gardens actually knew that night. The reality was not a simple scene in which 38 people stood at their windows and watched a woman being murdered. The people in the neighborhood did not share one perspective. They occupied different apartments, looked toward different parts of the area, heard different sounds, and understood different fragments of what was happening. Some heard Kitty's cries. Some became aware that there was a disturbance. Some had no clear view of the attack, and some people attempted to obtain help. The distinction between hearing something and understanding it would become one of the most important parts of the case. In the darkness of the early morning, a scream can have many possible meanings to someone who hears it without seeing its source. It can sound like an argument, a cry of fear, a disturbance between strangers, or something else entirely. The person hearing it may not know who is involved or whether the danger is continuing. That uncertainty became especially important because Kitty's attack happened in more than one stage. The first assault was interrupted when a neighbor opened a window and shouted at Moseley to leave. The woman alone. Moseley ran away. To someone who witnessed only that moment, the immediate danger could have appeared to be finished. The attacker was gone. The woman was still alive. The situation appeared to have changed. But Kitty was badly wounded and still trying to reach safety. She moved toward the area behind the building and toward an entrance or vestibule near the Long Island Railroad tracks. That location was less visible from many of the surrounding apartments. Moseley returned and attacked her again. The second phase of the violence therefore unfolded in circumstances very different from the first. This fact alone makes the later image of dozens of people watching the entire murder impossible to accept as a straightforward description of what happened. The physical setting did not allow everyone who heard the earlier disturbance to see the later attack. Some people could hear without seeing. Others could perhaps see only part of what was happening. Others may not have understood that the separate sounds they encountered were connected. And this is where the famous story begins to separate from the more complicated reality. On March 27, 1964, 2 weeks after Kitty's death, the New York Times published a widely discussed article with the headline, 37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police. The article presented an extraordinary picture. According to the story, A large number of people had been aware of Kitty's attack, but had failed to summon the police. The account captured public attention because it seemed to reveal something deeply disturbing about urban life. The neighborhood was not empty. People were nearby. Yet the story suggested that Kitty had cried out while those around her remained passive. The number associated with the account soon became 38. From there, the case entered public consciousness as a morality tale. The murderer was Winston Moseley, but the headline placed another question at the center of the story. What had everyone else done? The image was powerful because it seemed almost impossible. 38 people, one woman, a murder, no effective intervention. It was a story that appeared to explain something about human nature. It suggested that people could see suffering and still remain still. It suggested that modern city life had produced a kind of emotional isolation in which neighbors could live close together while remaining strangers. It suggested that when many people witnessed the same emergency, responsibility might become diluted. If everyone assumed that another person would call the police, then perhaps nobody would. The story seemed to contain a warning for an entire society. But the story had compressed a complicated series of events into a much simpler narrative. Later researchers and journalists would return to the original circumstances and find that the famous version was seriously exaggerated. There was no evidence that 38 people stood at their windows and watched the entire murder. That distinction is essential. The number did not represent 38 people who all possessed the same information. Many people had heard screams rather than witnessed the attack. Some did not understand what was happening. Many apartments did not have a direct view of the location where Kitty was attacked. And the most serious part of the assault took place in a comparatively concealed area. The idea that 38 people watched Kitty die, therefore, creates an image that the evidence does not support. The difference between the popular story and the more complicated reality also becomes clear when we remember Sophia Farrar. Farrar lived nearby and went to Kitty after learning what had happened. Kitty was already gravely wounded, but Farrar stayed with her and called for help. She remained beside Kitty until emergency personnel arrived. Her actions are important not because they erase the failures or confusion surrounding the night, but because they contradict the absolute version of the legend. Kitty was not completely abandoned by everyone. Someone came to her. Someone stayed with her. Someone sought assistance. The presence of Farrar does not answer every question about the other residents, and it does not make the circumstances of Kitty's death any less tragic. But it reminds us that the story cannot be divided into two simple categories, one killer on one side, and 38 indifferent spectators on the other. The actual night was more fragmented than that. Different people knew different things. Some heard something without understanding it. Some perceived only the first part of the attack. Some did not have a direct line of sight, and at least one person went to Kitty and stayed with her. The number 38 itself also requires caution. The supplied account indicates that the figure emerged through discussions surrounding what residents knew or heard about the incident and was subsequently transformed into the famous newspaper narrative. What had initially been an estimate concerning people who had some awareness of the event became, in the public imagination, a claim that 38 people had witnessed a murder and deliberately refused to help. Those are not the same statement. The difference may appear small when reduced to a sentence, but historically it is enormous. One describes a confusing emergency perceived from multiple locations. The other describes a deliberate collective decision to allow a woman to die. The second image is far more dramatic, but drama is not the same as accuracy. The later reassessment of the case, therefore, does not mean that the original murder was unimportant, or that no one failed to respond. It means that the historical record is more complicated than the famous headline suggested. That complexity matters because the story of Kitty Genovese became influential far beyond the crime itself. Her name became associated with a question that would occupy psychologists and the public for years. Why might people fail to act when they believe someone else is present? The case became connected with what would later be called the bystander effect. Psychologists Bibb Lawtain and John Darley studied situations in which people might be less likely to intervene when they believed that other people were also present. The basic idea was that responsibility could become psychologically dispersed. When one person is alone with an emergency, the responsibility to act can feel direct. When many people are apparently present, each individual may assume that someone else will respond. The concept became important in psychology, but the connection to Kitty's murder needs to be handled carefully. The bystander effect is a real subject of psychological research. The famous story of Kitty Genovese, however, was not an accurate account of 38 people watching a complete murder and collectively choosing to do nothing. Using the case as though that exact scene had been established would repeat the same misunderstanding that helped create the legend in the first place. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of the story. Kitty's death became evidence for an idea that depended, at least in part, on a version of the event that was itself inaccurate. Her suffering became a lesson before the public fully understood what had happened to her. The woman became a symbol, and the symbol became more famous than the complicated reality behind it. But Kitty's story was never really about a number. It was about a person who was attacked while trying to get home. It was about a dangerous man who deliberately selected her as his victim. It was about a first attack that was interrupted, a wounded woman attempting to reach safety, and a second attack that took place in a less visible area. It was about people who heard different fragments of a frightening event without necessarily understanding its meaning. It was about Sophia Farrar coming to Kitty and staying with her until help arrived. And it was about how a newspaper story transformed all of those fragments into a single, unforgettable image. The 38 witnesses became one of the most enduring elements of the case. But the number should never be allowed to replace the facts. Kitty did not die as an experiment in human psychology. She did not exist to prove a theory about urban indifference. She was a woman who was deliberately targeted by Winston Moseley and who fought to survive after the first attack. The tragedy was real. The fear was real. The injuries were real. The death was real. What was not real was the simple image of 38 people calmly watching the entire murder from their windows. To understand what happened next, the story must move away from the witnesses and toward the people searching for Kitty's killer. In the days after the murder, police were left with a dead woman, incomplete observations, reports of screams, and memories of a suspicious vehicle. Moseley was still free. The neighborhood still did not know who had committed the crime. And for a brief period, the identity of the man who had followed Kitty into the darkness remained unknown. Then, only 6 days after the murder, an apparently unrelated incident in Ozone Park would bring Winston Moseley into police custody and suddenly begin to reveal just how much larger the story really was. In the days after Kitty Genovese was killed, the streets of Kew Gardens held the traces of a crime that had already begun to attract attention. But the man responsible for it was still free. The police knew that a young woman had been attacked while making her way home. They knew that the assault had occurred in stages. They knew that Kitty had cried for help, that people nearby had become aware of a disturbance, and that an attacker had temporarily fled before returning. They also knew that the second part of the attack had taken place in a less visible area behind the building, near an entrance or vestibule close to the Long Island Railroad tracks. What they did not yet know was the identity of the man who had deliberately selected Kitty as his victim. The investigation, therefore, began with fragments. Police interviewed people who lived in the surrounding apartments and tried to reconstruct what had happened during those early morning minutes. Their task was complicated by the fact that no single witness necessarily possessed the entire picture. One person might have heard a scream, another might have noticed movement, another might have remembered a vehicle. Someone else might have known only that there had been an unusual disturbance outside during the night. These observations were valuable, but they did not automatically produce an identification. The later mythology surrounding the case would make it seem as though dozens of people had possessed a clear view of the murder. The investigation itself was more complicated. The people who lived nearby did not experience the event from one common vantage point. They were separated by apartment walls, windows, streets, and the physical layout of the neighborhood. Some could hear what others could not see. Some could see only part of what was happening. And the most serious part of the attack occurred in an area that was largely hidden from many. Surrounding apartments. This meant that investigators had to assemble the story piece by piece. Kitty's cries were one part of that story. The attack itself was another. The retreat of the assailant was another. The attacker's return was another. And somewhere within those fragments might be a detail that could lead police to the person responsible. Among the information available to investigators were observations concerning a vehicle. Some residents remembered a vehicle associated with the disturbance, and those details would later become important. At this stage, however, they were simply pieces of information in a homicide investigation. Police did not yet know that the man they were searching for was Winston Moseley. They did not yet know that Moseley had been looking for a woman to attack when he noticed Kitty. They did not yet know that the same man had been involved in other serious crimes. And they certainly did not know that their eventual suspect would confess not only to Kitty's murder, but to 2 other killings and additional sexual assaults and burglaries. For a short time, the case remained uncertain. Kitty was dead, her killer was unknown, and investigators had to work from incomplete observations. The possibility that the murder might remain unsolved was real. Then, 6 days after Kitty's death, the investigation took an unexpected turn. On March 19, 1964, Winston Moseley was arrested in Ozone Park in connection with a suspected burglary. The arrest did not begin as a direct solution to Kitty Genovese's murder. Moseley had apparently been noticed while taking a television from a neighbor's home. A local person became suspicious of what he was doing and contacted police. It was an apparently separate incident, but the arrest placed Moseley in police custody at exactly the moment when the Kitty Genovese investigation needed a breakthrough. Investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding him. His vehicle attracted attention because of similarities to the vehicle information that had emerged. During the investigation of Kitty's murder, what had previously been an uncertain detail now had a possible connection to a living suspect. Police questioned Moseley, and then the case changed completely. Moseley confessed to killing Kitty Genovese. The confession did more than give investigators a name. It provided a direct connection between the suspect in custody and the murder that had taken place 6 days earlier in Kew Gardens. But it also opened a much darker chapter. Moseley told investigators that Kitty was not the only woman he had killed. He confessed to the murders of Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik. He also admitted to other crimes, including sexual assaults and burglaries. Suddenly, the police investigation was no longer simply the search for the person responsible for Kitty's death. It was uncovering the activities of a man whose criminal behavior extended beyond a single night and a single victim. This development was important because it changed the understanding of who Winston Moseley was. Before his arrest, he was an unknown attacker who had appeared in the darkness of Kew Gardens and disappeared. After his confession, investigators could see a larger pattern of violent and criminal behavior. His actions were not limited to one encounter. There were other victims and other offenses. The woman who had been killed on her way home had been targeted by a man who had already been involved in dangerous behavior and who would later admit to multiple serious crimes. Moseley's own account also helped clarify the question of motive. According to the supplied information, he had been out looking for a woman to attack. He was not simply looking for someone to rob. Kitty became his target after he noticed her. This made the murder even more disturbing because it meant that Kitty's presence in the wrong place, at the wrong time, had intersected with a deliberate search for a victim. She had not been known to Moseley. There was no established personal relationship between them. He did not need to know her to decide that she would become his target. He saw her, selected her, and followed her. The investigation therefore revealed something that the initial uncertainty had hidden. The apparent randomness of Kitty's death concealed a deliberate choice made by her attacker. The police also had to consider the information contained in Mosley's confession. A confession could help explain what had happened, but it also had to be considered within the broader investigation and eventual legal process. The facts surrounding Kitty's death had to be established sufficiently for a prosecution. The details that witnesses had provided had to be understood in relation to Mosley's account. The vehicle information had to be considered alongside his presence and arrest. And the circumstances of the other crimes he confessed to provided investigators with a larger picture of his behavior. The case was no longer an unknown murder. It had a suspect, a confession, and a possible motive. Within only 6 days, the investigation had moved from uncertainty to the identification of a man who admitted responsibility. Yet the discovery of Mosley created another set of questions. Why had he chosen Kitty? What had been happening in his life before the murder? How could a married man with children have been simultaneously involved in such dangerous and violent behavior? And what would happen when he stood before a court and attempted to explain his actions? Those questions would become central to the next stage of the case. The police investigation had found the man responsible for Kitty's death, but the legal process would now have to determine his guilt and consider his mental state. Mosley would eventually claim that he was not legally responsible in the ordinary sense because of insanity. Before that argument reached the courtroom, however, investigators had learned enough from his confession to understand that Kitty's murder was part of a larger pattern. The same man who had followed Kitty through Kew Gardens had admitted to killing other women and committing additional violent crimes. The image of an unknown attacker had been replaced by the reality of a dangerous offender who had deliberately searched for victims. The speed of the breakthrough was striking. Kitty died on March 13th. 6 days later, the man who had killed her was in custody. The arrest itself arose from a suspected burglary rather than from a dramatic confrontation, connected directly to the murder. A local person's suspicion led to police involvement. The vehicle associated with Mosley provided an important connection. Questioning followed. Then came the confession. In that sequence, the investigation demonstrates how a case can change through an unexpected chain of events. One moment, investigators are working with fragments and uncertain observations. The next, they have a suspect who admits the crime and reveals additional offenses. But solving the murder did not undo what had happened to Kitty. It could not return her to the apartment she had been trying to reach. It could not erase the fear and violence of that night. It could not restore the life she had before March 13th. And it could not prevent her death from becoming attached to a public story that would eventually overshadow much of the investigation itself. The police had found Winston Mosley, but the public was about to learn far more about him. His confession would lead to questions about motive, sexual violence, responsibility, and mental illness. The case would move from the streets of Kew Gardens into a courtroom, where the question would no longer be simply who killed Kitty Genovese. That question had been answered. The harder legal question would be whether Winston Mosley should be held fully responsible for what he had done. In June 1964, only a few months after Kitty's death, that question would become the center of the trial. The man who had followed her home would stand before a jury, and the story that had begun with an unknown attacker in the darkness would enter its next stage. A courtroom where guilt, insanity, and punishment would determine what happened to Winston Mosley. For Kitty, there would be no second chance. For her killer, there would be decades of legal proceedings, imprisonment, appeals, and eventually another series of crimes. But the first great mystery had been solved. The unknown man in the darkness had a name. He was Winston Mosley, and he had confessed. By the time Winston Mosley was taken into custody, the investigation had already established the most important facts surrounding Kitty Genovese's death. The man who had followed her home was no longer unknown. But identifying a killer is not the same as understanding him. And in Mosley's case, The questions that followed were disturbing precisely because they went beyond a single night in Kew Gardens. He was 29 years old, married, and a father. From the outside, there was nothing in those basic facts that would automatically identify him as a dangerous offender. Yet the investigation would reveal a very different reality. Mosley had dangerous sexual and violent tendencies, and his criminal behavior extended beyond Kitty Genovese. He had been involved in burglaries and attacks against women, and after his arrest he confessed to other killings and additional serious offenses. The contrast between his ordinary outward circumstances and his criminal behavior became an important part of understanding the case. There was no simple explanation that could reduce him to a stranger who had suddenly become violent. For one unexplained reason. According to the information available in the case, Mosley had been looking for a woman to attack on the night Kitty died. He was not simply traveling through Queens without a purpose. He was searching for a victim. When he noticed Kitty, he selected her. That decision is crucial because it establishes the deliberate nature of the encounter. Kitty did not know Mosley. There was no established personal relationship between them, no known dispute, and no evidence in the supplied information that she had done anything to provoke him. She became the target because Mosley decided that she would be. He followed her, carrying a hunting knife, and attacked her as she made her way home. When a neighbor shouted at him, Mosley temporarily retreated, but he returned. The second attack followed after Kitty had attempted to move towards safety. The sequence of events raised an important question about Mosley's state of mind. There is a profound difference between an act committed in an uncontrollable moment and a sequence in which a person searches for a victim, chooses that victim, follows her, attacks her, retreats when interrupted, and then returns. The supplied information does not provide a basis for diagnosing Mosley beyond the psychiatric issues considered during his legal proceedings, and it would be irresponsible to invent an explanation for his internal state. What can be established is that investigators found evidence of dangerous sexual and violent tendencies, and that the question of his mental condition became central once the case reached court. Mosley's confession also widened the scope of the investigation. He admitted that Kitty was not his only victim. He confessed to killing Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik. He also admitted to other sexual assaults and burglaries. Those admissions changed the way authorities could view the offender. The murder of Kitty Genovese was no longer an isolated act committed by a man whose history was unknown. The police were now dealing with someone who had acknowledged involvement in multiple serious crimes. Each additional confession raised the possibility that other women had encountered the same dangerous behavior. Mosley's account, therefore, became more than an admission of guilt in a single homicide. It became a window into a broader pattern of offending. But even with the confession, the question of motive required careful treatment. It is tempting to search for one explanation that makes a terrible act understandable. But understanding motive does not mean excusing behavior. And in this case, the available information does not provide a justification for what Mosley did. His actions were connected to sexual and violent impulses, according to the material provided, and his own account indicated that he had been looking for a woman to attack. That fact is enough to establish the terrifying randomness from Kitty's perspective. She did not need to know her attacker. She did not need to have any connection to him. She only needed to cross his path. In that sense, the danger Kitty faced was not created by a conflict between two people. It was created by Mosley's decision to turn a stranger into a victim. The confession also made it possible to compare Mosley's account with the circumstances already known about Kitty's death. Investigators knew that Kitty had been attacked, that she had cried out, that the attacker had initially fled after being confronted, and that he had later returned. They knew that Kitty had attempted to move towards safety and that the second part of the attack occurred in a less visible area. Mosley's confession placed him at the center of those events. The man who had seemed to disappear into the darkness now acknowledged responsibility. For the investigation, that was an enormous development. For the legal system, However, it was only the beginning. A confession could establish what a defendant said he had done, but the court would still have to determine the appropriate legal response. Mosley's defense would eventually focus on his mental state. At trial, he would initially plead not guilty, and his lawyers would raise an insanity defense. This introduced a difficult distinction between criminal behavior and legal responsibility. A person can commit an act and still raise questions about whether a mental disorder affected his ability to understand or control his behavior in a way recognized by the law. The court would therefore have to consider not only the brutal facts of the crimes, but also the psychological evidence concerning Mosley. The psychiatric questions surrounding him became part of the case because his defense sought to challenge the ordinary assumption of responsibility. The supplied information does not provide enough detail to reconstruct every psychiatric examination or every expert statement made during the proceedings. So those details should not be invented. What is clear is that the insanity argument became a significant part of the defense. It was not simply a question of whether Mosley had committed the acts. His own confession had already connected him to the murder. The more difficult legal issue was whether his mental condition should alter the way the law judged him. That question would become central in June 1964 when the case went to trial. Before the courtroom proceedings began, however, the broader picture of Mosley was already disturbing. He was a man who had deliberately sought a female victim, who had selected Kitty after noticing her, who had attacked her with a knife, and who had returned after initially fleeing. He was also a man who admitted to 2 other murders and additional crimes. These facts would become part of the prosecution's case and part of the public understanding of the man responsible for Kitty's death. Yet it is important not to allow the offender's history to overwhelm Kitty's story. True crime narratives can easily shift attention toward the killer because his motives, behavior, and psychological profile seem to offer an endless supply of questions. But Mosley's fascination as a criminal figure should never replace the human reality of the victim. Kitty was not killed because she was part of Mosley's story. She was killed because Mosley chose her as a target. The consequences were carried by Kitty, her friend Mary and Zelenko, her family, and everyone who knew her. The legal system could punish Mosley, but it could not reverse the choice he had made. The case also demonstrates why the distinction between explanation and justification matters. The existence of violent or sexual impulses does not make a murder inevitable, and it does not remove the responsibility to recognize the victim's humanity. Mosley's later behavior would make that point even more starkly. His criminal history did not end with the murder investigation or the trial. Even after imprisonment, he would eventually commit another serious series of offenses during an escape in 1968. That later episode would show that the danger associated with Mosley did not disappear simply because he had been convicted. But in 1964, those events were still in the future. The immediate question was the trial. Prosecutors had a defendant who had confessed to Kitty's murder. The defense had raised insanity. The jury would hear evidence about the crime and Mosley's mental condition. The outcome would determine whether he received the ultimate punishment then available under New York law. As the courtroom proceedings approached, the case had therefore moved through several stages. First came the murder itself. Kitty Genovese deliberately targeted and attacked while walking home. Then came the investigation, residents questioned, fragments of information collected, and the search for the unknown attacker. Then came the unexpected arrest in Ozone Park, where Mosley was taken into custody in connection with a suspected burglary. His vehicle appeared connected to information from the Kitty investigation. He was questioned. He confessed, and his confession revealed other killings and other crimes. Finally came the question of responsibility. The man who had admitted killing Kitty would now have to face a jury. The defense would argue that insanity mattered. The prosecution would seek a conviction. And behind those legal arguments stood the irreversible reality of March 13, 1964. Kitty Genovese was dead. Nothing said in a courtroom could change that. The trial could only determine what the state would do with the man responsible. In June 1964, that process began. Winston Moseley entered the courtroom, carrying not only the accusation that he had killed Kitty, but the weight of a confession that had connected him to other violent crimes. The case that had begun with a woman walking home in the darkness had become a legal battle over guilt, mental state, and punishment. The next chapter would decide Moseley's immediate fate, but it would also begin a chain of events that would keep him inside the New York prison system for more than half a century. The man who had once been an unknown figure following Kitty through the early morning streets was now a convicted criminal waiting to learn whether he would live or die in prison. The courtroom would provide the answer. By June 1964, only a few months had passed since Kitty Genovese had been killed, but the case had already traveled far beyond the streets of Kew Gardens. Winston Moseley was no longer an unidentified attacker. He had been arrested on March 19th in Ozone Park in connection with a suspected burglary, and investigators had subsequently connected him to Kitty's murder. During questioning, Moseley confessed. He also admitted to the killings of Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik, as well as additional sexual assaults and burglaries. Now the case entered the courtroom, where the central question was no longer simply who had killed Kitty Genovese. That question had an answer. The question was how the law would judge the man who had admitted killing her. The trial began in June 1964. Moseley initially pleaded not guilty. His defense then moved toward an argument that would become one of the most important elements of the proceedings, that he was not legally responsible because of insanity. The defense, therefore, did not simply challenge the basic fact that Moseley had committed the crime. Instead, it sought to place his behavior within the context of his mental condition. That distinction mattered. A criminal trial can involve more than determining whether an accused person carried out an act. It can also involve the question of whether the defendant possessed the mental capacity required for legal responsibility. In Moseley's case, psychiatric questions were especially significant because investigators had uncovered his dangerous sexual and violent tendencies. The court would have to consider evidence relating to his psychological condition while also confronting the brutal circumstances of Kitty's death. The prosecution had a powerful case in the form of Moseley's own confession. He had admitted killing Kitty. His account was consistent with the central circumstances already known to investigators. He had been looking for a woman to attack, had noticed Kitty, followed her, and attacked her with a knife. After a neighbor shouted at him, he fled temporarily, only to return and attack Kitty again. She suffered multiple wounds and defensive injuries before eventually dying. The confession also revealed that Moseley's criminal behavior extended beyond Kitty. His admissions concerning Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik provided evidence of a broader pattern of violence. The additional sexual assaults and burglaries he acknowledged further complicated the picture of the defendant standing before the jury. Yet the trial could not simply become a judgment on every terrible thing Moseley had ever done. The immediate legal issue concerned the charges before the court and the defense arguments presented. In relation to them, Moseley's mental condition became central because his lawyers sought to establish that insanity should affect the verdict or his legal responsibility. The jury therefore faced two different kinds of information. On one side were the facts of the crime and Moseley's own admission. On the other was the question of whether his psychological condition altered the legal meaning of those actions. The distinction between those questions is easy to lose when looking backward at the case. The fact that Moseley behaved in a calculated and violent manner does not, by itself, settle every psychiatric or legal question. Likewise, the existence of psychological abnormalities does not erase the reality that a person was deliberately attacked and killed. The court had to consider both. During the proceedings, Moseley's conduct and his descriptions of his crimes were examined in the context of the defense argument. His behavior had a disturbing consistency. He had been searching for a woman to attack. He had selected Kitty after seeing her. He had followed her. He had carried a knife. He had attacked her, retreated when confronted, and then returned. Those actions were not presented as a single unexplained accident. They formed a sequence that prosecutors could use to argue that Mosley was responsible for what he had done. At the same time, the defense sought to explain those actions through his mental state. The issue of insanity, therefore, became a conflict between two interpretations of the same disturbing facts. Whether Mosley's behavior demonstrated deliberate criminal responsibility, or whether his mental condition was sufficiently abnormal to affect that responsibility under the law. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. On June 11, 1964, they found Winston Mosley guilty. The verdict brought a formal legal conclusion to the question of whether he was responsible for Kitty Genovese's murder. He was convicted, but the case was not finished. 4 days later, on June 15th, Mosley was sentenced to death. The sentence reflected the seriousness with which the court and the legal system treated the murder. Kitty had been deliberately targeted, attacked with a knife, and killed after her attacker returned to continue the assault. Mosley's own confession had connected him to the crime, while his admissions about other killings and offenses had revealed a broader pattern of violence. The death sentence therefore represented the most severe punishment available to the state at that time. According to contemporary accounts, Mosley showed little emotion when the sentence was announced. But whatever his reaction, the legal outcome was clear. He had been convicted and sentenced to die. For Kitty's loved ones, the verdict could not undo her death. It could not restore the life she had lost or remove the memories of the night when she had been attacked while trying to reach home. But the conviction established responsibility in the legal record. The man who had followed her was no longer simply a suspect. He was a convicted murderer. Yet even the death sentence would not be the final word on Mosley's fate. The legal system would continue to examine his case. In 1967, 3 years after the trial, a New York appellate court changed the death sentence to life imprisonment. The reason was connected to the insanity issue that had been raised during the original proceedings. The court determined that Mosley should have been given a fuller opportunity to present his argument concerning his mental condition during the sentencing stage. As a result, the death sentence was changed to life imprisonment. The change meant that Mosley would not be executed. Instead, he would spend the remainder of his life within the New York prison system. For the case of Kitty Genovese, this development introduced another long chapter. The trial had appeared to bring the story toward a final punishment. But the appellate decision reopened the question of what that punishment should be. Mosley had escaped the death penalty, not because the conviction had disappeared, but because the sentencing process had been found inadequate in relation to the mental health argument. He remained a convicted murderer, but his sentence was now life imprisonment. That distinction would become important because Mosley would live for decades after the original crime. His story did not end with the courtroom verdict in 1964. It continued inside the prison system, where he would later commit additional crimes. In 1968, only a few years into his imprisonment, Mosley escaped while being returned to prison after medical treatment. He attacked an employee who was transporting him and managed to flee. The escape would lead to another violent episode, one that would demonstrate that imprisonment had not ended his capacity to threaten other people. After escaping, Mosley entered a house on Grand Island and took a married couple hostage. According to the supplied information, he tied up the husband and raped the wife. He then took their vehicle and fled. His escape continued until he entered another house, where he held a woman and her daughter before eventually surrendering to police. Those later crimes resulted in additional sentences related to the escape and kidnapping. They also reinforced the disturbing pattern already visible in 1964. Mosley's violence had not been limited to Kitty Genovese. His later conduct showed that the danger represented by him continued even after he had been convicted and imprisoned. But those events belonged to the future. In June 1964, the immediate chapter was the trial and the death sentence. The jury had heard the case and rejected the insanity defense. Mosley had been found guilty on June 11th, and sentenced to death on June 15th. For a moment, it appeared that the state had reached the final stage of the case. Yet the appellate decision 3 years later demonstrated that criminal cases do not always end when a jury announces its verdict. Appeals can reopen questions about procedure, mental condition, sentencing, and the rights of the accused. Mosley's sentence was changed from death to life imprisonment, ensuring that he would remain alive inside the prison system for decades. The irony of the decision is that it did not bring an end to his story. Instead, it allowed the legal history of Winston Mosley to continue for more than 50 years after Kitty's death. For Kitty, there could be no appeal and no new proceeding. Her life had ended on March 13, 1964. For Mosley, however, the legal process continued. His conviction remained, his death sentence was changed, and his imprisonment became a long chapter in the history of the case. The public, meanwhile, continued to remember Kitty through another story, the story of the supposed 38 witnesses. That story had already begun to overshadow the actual investigation and trial. The trial established the identity and guilt of the killer, but it did not settle the questions surrounding what the neighbors had seen and heard. Those questions would continue to shape the case long after Mosley entered prison. The most famous version of the Genovese story suggested that dozens of people watched Kitty die and did nothing. Yet the courtroom record and later investigations would show that the reality was far more complicated. Some residents had heard rather than seen the attack. Some did not understand what was happening. Many could not see the second attack because of the location. And Sophia Farrar had gone to Kitty and remained with her while help was summoned. The legal conviction of Winston Mosley was therefore based on a very different foundation from the later cultural myth surrounding the case. The murder was real. The killer was identified. The jury found him guilty. The death sentence was imposed. Then the sentence was changed to life imprisonment. Those are the legal facts. The legend of the 38 witnesses was something else entirely, a story that would continue to grow even after the trial had ended. And as Mosley began his life sentence, the case entered a new and unexpected chapter. The killer was behind bars, but the story of Kitty Genovese was only beginning to influence the wider culture. Her name would become associated with questions about fear, responsibility, social behavior, and the willingness of ordinary people to intervene when someone is in danger. Yet before that legacy could fully develop, Winston Mosley would prove that his criminal history was not over. In 1968, he would escape from custody and commit another series of serious offenses. The man sentenced for Kitty's murder would once again become a danger outside prison walls, adding another layer to an already disturbing case. By the time Winston Mosley's death sentence had been changed to life imprisonment in 1967, the legal system had already established his responsibility for the murder of Kitty Genovese. The jury had found him guilty in June 1964, and the original sentence had been death. But an appellate decision later changed that punishment to life imprisonment after determining that Mosley should have been given a fuller opportunity to present his argument concerning his mental condition at sentencing. The decision meant that Mosley would remain alive, but it also meant something else. The story of his violence would continue. For Kitty's family and those who had known her, the change in sentence could not alter what had happened in Kew Gardens. Kitty was still dead. Mosley was still the man who had deliberately selected her as a victim, followed her, attacked her, temporarily fled, returned, and fatally wounded her. But the prison sentence placed him inside the New York prison system rather than on death row. At that point, one might have expected the danger he represented to be contained. Instead, in 1968, Mosley escaped. The escape occurred while he was being returned to prison following medical treatment. He attacked an employee who was transporting him and managed to get away. Suddenly, the man convicted of one of New York's most notorious murders was once again outside prison walls. The circumstances were especially disturbing because Mosley had already demonstrated the consequences of allowing him access to potential victims. His history was not limited to Kitty. After his original arrest, he had confessed to killing Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik, as well as other sexual assaults and burglaries. His escape therefore created a new danger, and what followed showed that his imprisonment had not ended his capacity for violence. After fleeing custody, Mosley entered a house on Grand Island. There, he encountered a married couple and took them hostage. According to the available account, he tied up the husband and raped the wife. He then took the couple's vehicle and used it to continue his escape. The episode was not simply an escape from custody anymore. It had become another violent crime involving people who had no connection to the original murder. Once again, Mosley had imposed himself upon strangers through force. Once again, another household became a place of fear because of his actions. And once again, the victims were left dealing with the consequences of a decision they had never made. Mosley's behavior during the escape reinforced an important fact about his criminal history. His violence had not been an isolated event in 1964. He had already admitted to other murders and serious offenses, and now, after conviction and imprisonment, he was committing another series of crimes. The pattern made the earlier events even more disturbing. Kitty had not been killed by a man whose violence ended after one terrible night. She had been killed by a man whose criminal behavior continued across different circumstances and against different victims. Yet Mosley was not finished. After taking the couple's vehicle, he entered another house. There, he encountered a woman and her daughter and held them captive. The situation eventually ended when Mosley surrendered to police. The escape was over, but its consequences continued. He received additional sentences connected to the escape and kidnapping. The legal system now had to account for crimes committed by a man who was already serving a life sentence for murder. The 1968 episode also changed the way Mosley's imprisonment could be understood. His life sentence had been intended to remove him from the public and prevent him from committing further crimes. His escape demonstrated the vulnerability of that protection. For the people who became his victims during those hours outside prison, the fact that Mosley had already been convicted of murder did not protect them. They encountered him simply as a dangerous stranger. This was one of the recurring themes of his criminal history. His victims often had no meaningful relationship with him. Kitty did not know him. The women involved in his other crimes were not necessarily connected to him. His violence was imposed upon people he selected. That reality makes the later escape especially significant. It was not merely an administrative failure or a dramatic prison episode. It created another opportunity for Mosley to exercise the same violent behavior that had already cost Kitty her life. His escape also complicates the way his imprisonment is sometimes remembered. A life sentence can sound like the end of a criminal story, a point at which the offender disappears behind prison walls and the public is safe from him. In Mosley's case, that assumption proved false. He escaped, committed further serious crimes, and was eventually recaptured after surrendering to police. The additional convictions ensured that the 1968 episode became another permanent part of his criminal record. But despite the seriousness of those crimes, the name Winston Mosley remained most strongly connected to Kitty Genovese. Her murder had already become famous for reasons that extended beyond the crime itself. The newspaper account about the supposed 38 witnesses had created a public narrative that focused attention on the behavior of bystanders. The later discovery of Mosley's broader criminal history added another dimension. The man who had killed Kitty was not an inexplicable figure who appeared once and disappeared. He was a repeat offender whose violence had affected multiple women. Yet the public memory of the case often focused less on that pattern and more on the neighbors. That imbalance is important. Mosley was responsible for the violence. The choices that night belonged to him. The famous narrative sometimes shifted the moral center of the story toward the people who heard or saw fragments of the attack. But the primary responsibility for Kitty's death belonged to the man who deliberately selected her and attacked her. The later escape made that responsibility even harder to ignore. After imprisonment, Mosley continued to commit crimes. His behavior showed that the danger identified by investigators in 1964 had not been imagined. He was capable of violence against strangers even after being convicted and sentenced. The 1968 episode, therefore, became a grim continuation rather than an unrelated footnote. For the victims of that escape, Mosley was not a historical figure. He was a present threat. The husband he tied up, the woman he raped, and the woman and daughter he later held captive experienced the same fundamental reality that Kitty had experienced. A stranger had entered their lives through violence, and their ability to choose what happened next had been taken away. Eventually, Mosley surrendered to police. His escape ended, and he returned to the prison system. The additional charges and sentences ensured that he would remain incarcerated. But the episode had demonstrated something that the original life sentence alone could not guarantee. Imprisonment only protects the public if the prisoner remains in custody. Mosley had managed to escape, and during that brief period outside, he committed further serious crimes. The incident also provided another painful contrast between the ordinary lives of victims and the criminal history of their attacker. Kitty had been walking home from work. The couple on Grand Island had been inside their home. The woman and her daughter in the second house had been living their own lives. None of them were participants in Mosley's criminal world. They simply encountered him. The violence came from him, not from any conflict they had created. That distinction is essential when looking at Mosley's life after the Genovese murder. It is easy in a famous criminal case to become absorbed in the psychology of the offender, to ask what drove him, what he thought, and why he behaved as he did. But the people affected by his crimes did not have the luxury of treating those questions as abstract subjects. They experienced the consequences directly. Kitty lost her life. Other women lost their lives or suffered sexual violence. The people caught during Mosley's escape were subjected to terror and captivity. His criminal history was measured not in theories but in victims. After the 1968 escape, Mosley remained imprisoned for decades. He repeatedly sought parole, but his requests were not granted. The man who had once been sentenced to death and later given life imprisonment would spend the overwhelming majority of his remaining life behind bars. His story had moved from the streets of Kew Gardens to the courtroom, from death row to life imprisonment, and then briefly outside the prison walls before returning there again. But the most enduring legacy of the case was still being formed elsewhere. While Mosley lived inside the prison system, Kitty Genovese's name continued to circulate in newspapers, books, classrooms, and psychological discussions. The phrase, 38 witnesses, became shorthand for an idea about human behavior. Yet as the decades passed, researchers and journalists began questioning the accuracy of that story. The more closely people examined the original circumstances, the clearer it became that the popular account had exaggerated what the residents of Kew Gardens actually knew. Many had heard rather than seen the attack. Some could not see the second assault. Some did not understand that a murder was taking place. And Sophia Farrar had gone to Kitty and remained with her while help was sought. The irony was profound. Winston Mosley, the man responsible for the physical violence, remained at the center of the crime. But the public memory increasingly treated Kitty's murder as a story about the people around her. Meanwhile, Mosley himself continued his life in prison, largely removed from ordinary society. His 1968 escape nevertheless ensured that he would remain part of the historical record not only as Kitty's killer, but as a repeat offender who had committed further crimes after conviction. Eventually, he would spend more than 50 years incarcerated. He would repeatedly seek release, but he would not regain his freedom. On March 28, 2016, Winston Mosley died in prison at the age of 81. He had spent approximately 52 years behind bars since his arrest in 1964. His death marked the end of the life of the man who had killed Kitty Genovese. But it did not end the debate surrounding her case. In many ways, that debate was only becoming more complicated. The central question was no longer simply what Mosley had done. His guilt was established. Nor was the question simply whether the neighborhood had failed Kitty. The evidence showed a far more complicated picture than the famous headline suggested. The deeper question became how a distorted version of one woman's murder could become one of the most influential stories about human behavior in modern American history. That transformation would eventually force journalists, researchers, and even the New York Times to reconsider what had really happened in Kew Gardens. And that is where the story moves next, away from Mosley's prison life and toward the second life of the case, the life Kitty Genovese's murder acquired in the public imagination. By the time Winston Mosley died in prison in 2016, the murder of Kitty Genovese had existed in the public imagination for more than half a century. Mosley had spent approximately 52 years behind bars after his arrest in 1964, and his criminal history had long been established. Yet the story most people remembered was not necessarily the story of the investigation, the confession, the trial, or even the later escape. It was a number, 38. The phrase 38 witnesses had become so closely attached to Kitty Genovese that it could seem almost inseparable from her identity. For decades, the case was presented as one of the clearest examples of human indifference in an urban society. A young woman had been attacked and killed, the story went, while dozens of people watched and failed to help. The supposed behavior of those witnesses became a subject of public outrage, and eventually a subject of scientific study. But as researchers and journalists returned to the original events, they discovered that the famous version was far more complicated than the headline had suggested. The central problem was not that nothing had happened. Something terrible had happened. Kitty had been deliberately targeted by Winston Mosley, attacked with a knife, and fatally wounded. The problem was that the story surrounding the witnesses had gradually changed the meaning of what people had actually seen and heard. The famous newspaper account appeared on March 27, 1964, 2 weeks after Kitty's murder. Under the headline, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The article created a powerful image of a neighborhood in which numerous people were aware of the crime but failed to intervene. That image was emotionally overwhelming. It seemed to suggest that modern city life had produced an unusual kind of isolation. People could live close to one another and still remain detached from the suffering of someone only a short distance away. The story also appeared to contain a broader lesson. If dozens of people were present during an emergency, perhaps each person could assume that somebody else would take responsibility. The responsibility to act might become diluted simply because there were many potential witnesses. The case, therefore, seemed to provide a real-world example of a troubling psychological phenomenon. Later, psychologists Bibb Lawtain and John Darley studied what became known as the bystander effect. Their work examined how the presence of other people can influence whether an individual responds to an emergency. One possible explanation is that people look to others for information about how serious a situation is. If everyone appears uncertain, an individual may interpret that uncertainty as evidence that action is unnecessary. Another factor is the diffusion of responsibility. When many people are present, each person may feel less personally responsible because there are other people who could act. These ideas became highly influential in psychology. But the connection between the research and Kitty's murder requires an important qualification. The bystander effect is a genuine psychological phenomenon. But the Genovese case was not the simple real-life experiment that popular accounts sometimes implied. There was no established group of 38 people standing together and watching the entire murder. The people living around Kitty experienced the night from different locations and with different amounts of information. Some heard screams. Some heard or noticed only part of the disturbance. Many apartments did not provide a direct view of the locations where Kitty was attacked. The second and most serious phase of the attack took place behind the building, near an entrance or vestibule close to the Long Island Railroad tracks, where much of the surrounding area was hidden from view. This physical fact alone makes the popular image of 38 people watching the entire crime deeply misleading. The residents did not possess one common understanding of what was happening. They possessed fragments. One person might hear a cry without seeing the person who made it. Another might see a man retreat after being confronted. Someone else might hear additional sounds later without knowing that they were connected to the earlier attack. A person could therefore become aware that something unusual had happened without realizing that a woman was being murdered. This distinction is fundamental. Knowing that there is a disturbance is not the same as knowing that someone is dying. Hearing a scream is not the same as seeing an attacker with a knife. Seeing an attacker run away is not the same as knowing that he will return. And knowing that an injured person is somewhere nearby is not the same as having a clear view of what happened to her. The original story compressed all these different levels of knowledge into a single category: witnesses. Over time, that word became associated with people who had supposedly seen the murder in full. Later research challenged that interpretation. A study published in 2007 concluded that there was no evidence supporting the famous version in which 38 people watched the murder and collectively refused to help. The findings did not mean that every person who heard something responded perfectly. They did not erase the uncertainty and confusion of the night. They did not transform the case into a story in which everyone acted heroically. Instead, they demonstrated that the historical record was more complicated than the famous narrative. One of the most important facts was the role of Sophia Farrar. Farrar lived nearby and went to Kitty after learning what had happened. She found Kitty severely injured, called for help, and remained with her until emergency personnel arrived. This fact is especially significant because it directly contradicts the absolute form of the legend. Kitty was not completely abandoned by everyone around her. Someone came to her. Someone stayed beside her. Someone sought assistance. The existence of Farrar does not mean that all questions about the reactions of others disappear. It does not tell us what every resident should have understood or whether everyone who heard something could reasonably have recognized the danger. But it demonstrates why the phrase 38 people watched and did nothing is not an accurate description of the event. There was no single collective response. There were individual people making decisions based on incomplete information. That reality makes the case more human, but also more difficult to summarize. The myth offers a clean moral judgment. The facts require uncertainty. And uncertainty is harder to remember than a number. The origin of the number 38 became another part of the mystery. According to the supplied account, the figure emerged through discussions between New York Times editor A.M. Rosenthal and New York City Police Commissioner Michael Murphy. Murphy was said to have told Rosenthal that approximately 38 people knew about or had heard something connected to the incident. That information was then incorporated into the newspaper narrative. But the meaning of the number changed. People who knew or heard something gradually became people who witnessed the murder. Once that transformation occurred, the number acquired a power that the underlying evidence could not support. 38 was no longer simply an estimate. It became a symbol. It represented indifference. It represented urban alienation. It represented the fear that a person could cry for help while an entire community remained silent. The irony is that the symbol became more famous than the facts that produced it. Kitty Genovese's murder was transformed into a lesson about society before the public had fully understood the details of the crime. Her death became part of psychological literature, journalism, discussions of morality, and debates about the responsibilities of bystanders. Yet the actual woman at the center of the story could disappear behind the lesson. This is one of the greatest dangers in turning a real crime into a cultural symbol. The victim becomes an example rather than a person. The crime becomes an experiment rather than a tragedy. The witnesses become a statistic rather than individuals who were confronted with a frightening and confusing situation in the middle of the night. And the killer can sometimes become almost secondary to the social meaning attached to the case. But the physical violence came from Winston Moseley, He was the person who chose Kitty as his victim. He was the person who followed her. He was the person who attacked her with a knife. He was the person who returned after initially fleeing. And he was the person who confessed after his arrest. The later debates about bystander behavior should never obscure that fundamental fact. The public fascination with the witnesses also created an unusual historical irony. A story that was partly based on inaccurate assumptions became the foundation for serious research into human behavior. Psychologists used the case as part of a broader discussion about intervention and responsibility. The research itself contributed to a better understanding of how people behave in emergencies. But the case that helped inspire the research was not accurately represented by the popular legend. In that sense, Kitty Genovese became famous twice, first as the victim of a horrific murder, and then as the central figure in a story about bystanders that was itself later challenged. The second version of her story did not erase the first. It complicated it. As decades passed, journalists and researchers returned to the evidence and questioned the original newspaper narrative. The New York Times itself eventually acknowledged that the 1964 article had seriously exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they actually knew. This admission was significant because the newspaper story had played such a major role in establishing the case's public meaning. The correction did not change the identity of Kitty's killer. It did not change the verdict. It did not change the fact that Kitty died on March 13, 1964. It changed how the world understood the people who had been nearby. The case, therefore, became a lesson not only about human behavior, but also about journalism. A compelling story can be powerful enough to survive for decades, even when important details are wrong. Once a narrative becomes culturally established, correcting it can be extraordinarily difficult. People remember the headline. They remember the number. They remember the moral. They may not remember the qualifications that came later. Kitty Genovese's name became permanently connected with 38, even though the evidence did not support the image that number eventually created. The deeper tragedy is that the distortion affected the memory of Kitty herself. Instead of being remembered primarily as a young woman whose life was violently taken, she became a symbol of what was supposedly wrong with everyone around her. The story shifted attention from the person who committed the murder to the people who allegedly failed to prevent it. A more accurate account restores the balance. Kitty was the victim. Mosley was the killer. The residents were individuals who perceived different fragments of a frightening event. Some failed to respond adequately. Some did not understand what they were hearing. Some could not see the crucial part of the attack. And Sophia Farrar went to Kitty and stayed with her while help was summoned. There is no need to turn these facts into a simple story of collective innocence or collective guilt. The truth is more difficult and therefore more honest. The legacy of Kitty Genovese is ultimately a story about two kinds of consequences. One came from the crime itself, the death of a 28-year-old woman, and the decades of imprisonment imposed upon the man who killed her. The other came from the story told about the crime, a narrative that influenced psychology and public discussions of bystander behavior, even though its central details were later shown to be seriously exaggerated. Winston Mosley died in prison in 2016, but the questions surrounding Kitty's case did not die with him. They remain because the case sits at the intersection of violence, memory, journalism, and human psychology. And perhaps the most important lesson is not that 38 people watched a woman die. The evidence does not support that claim. The more difficult lesson is that real tragedies rarely unfold in the clean, simple way that headlines suggest. People see fragments. They misunderstand events. Information travels imperfectly. Stories become simplified. Numbers become symbols. And eventually, the symbol can become more famous than the truth. To remember Kitty Genovese accurately, we have to resist that temptation. Her death was not an experiment. Her suffering was not a psychological demonstration. She was a person who was attacked by a man who had deliberately chosen her as a victim. She tried to escape. She was attacked again. Sophia Farrar came to her. Help was summoned, and despite those efforts, Kitty died. The tragedy is already terrible without adding a myth to it. And the final chapter of her story would come not from another crime committed by Mosley, but from the long process of correcting how America remembered what happened that night. The story of Kitty Genovese does not end with the conviction of Winston Mosley, and it does not end with Mosley's death in prison more than half a century later. In many ways, the most complicated part of the story came afterward, when the murder was transformed from a criminal case into a cultural symbol. Kitty became associated with a number, a headline, and a psychological concept. Her name entered discussions about morality, responsibility, urban isolation, and the behavior of strangers during emergencies. Yet beneath all those interpretations was a much simpler and more painful truth. Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese was a 28-year-old woman whose life ended when a stranger deliberately chose her as a victim. On March 13, 1964, she had been returning home after finishing work. She had no reason to expect that the ordinary journey back to her apartment would become the final journey of her life. Winston Mosley was responsible for changing that ordinary night into a murder. He had been searching for a woman to attack. When he saw Kitty, he followed her. He attacked her with a knife, fled after a neighbor shouted at him, and then returned to continue the assault. Kitty suffered multiple wounds and defensive injuries. She was taken for emergency treatment, but the injuries were fatal. She died that same day. Everything that came afterward began with that irreversible loss. The police investigation initially faced the problem of an unidentified attacker. Residents were questioned. Some had heard screams. Some had noticed parts of what was happening. Information concerning a vehicle emerged. But there was no immediate suspect who could be placed before investigators as the obvious killer. Then, on March 19th, only 6 days after the murder, Mosley was arrested in Ozone Park in connection with a suspected burglary. A local resident had become suspicious after seeing him taking a television from a neighbor's house and contacted police. Investigators noticed circumstances surrounding Mosley and his vehicle that appeared connected to information from the Genovese investigation. Once questioned, Mosley confessed to killing Kitty. The confession went further. He admitted killing Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik, and he described additional sexual assaults and burglaries. Suddenly, the investigation of one murder revealed a much broader criminal history. Mosley was no longer an unknown man who had disappeared after attacking Kitty. He was a repeat offender whose behavior had affected multiple victims. His trial began in June 1964. He pleaded not guilty, and his defense raised insanity as a central argument. The jury ultimately rejected that defense and found him guilty on June 11th. 4 days later, he was sentenced to death. But that sentence did not remain in place. In 1967, a New York appellate court changed the death sentence to life imprisonment after determining that Mosley should have been allowed a fuller opportunity to present his argument concerning his mental condition at sentencing. The change did not erase the conviction. It changed the punishment. Mosley would remain imprisoned rather than face execution. Yet, even that was not the end of his criminal behavior. In 1968, Mosley escaped while being returned to prison after medical treatment. He attacked an employee involved in transporting him and fled. He later entered a house on Grand Island, where he held a married couple hostage. According to the available account, he tied up the husband and raped the wife before taking their vehicle. He then entered another home and held a woman and her daughter before eventually surrendering to police. He received additional sentences related to the escape and kidnapping. The episode was a disturbing confirmation that the danger associated with Mosley had not ended with his original conviction. His life sentence placed him behind bars, but during the escape, he was able to commit additional violent crimes. Afterward, he remained incarcerated for decades. He repeatedly sought parole, but his requests were denied. He finally died in prison on March 28, 2016, at the age of 81. By then, More than 50 years had passed since Kitty Genovese's death. Mosley had spent approximately 52 years in prison since his arrest. His death closed the biological life of the man responsible for Kitty's murder, but it did not close the historical questions surrounding the case. Those questions had long since expanded beyond the killer. The most famous was the story of the 38 witnesses. On March 27, 1964, the New York Times published the headline, "37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police." The article presented a deeply disturbing image of a woman being attacked while numerous people watched from their apartments and did nothing. The story shocked the nation. It appeared to describe an extraordinary failure of human compassion. Over time, however, the accuracy of that account was challenged. Later researchers found no evidence that 38 people had watched the murder from beginning to end. The physical layout of the area made such a scenario unlikely. Many residents did not have a direct view of the locations where Kitty was attacked. Some heard screams rather than seeing the assault. Some noticed only fragments. Some did not understand that a murder was taking place. Most importantly, the second attack occurred in a less visible area behind the building, near the entrance or vestibule close to the Long Island Railroad tracks. The popular image of dozens of people watching the entire killing was therefore inaccurate. The distinction between hearing something and seeing a murder is not a minor technicality. It changes the moral meaning of the story. A person who hears a scream through a window may not know whether it comes from an argument, an accident, a fight, or a serious crime. A person who sees someone run away may not know that the attacker will return. A person who realizes that something is wrong may still not understand the scale of the danger. These are different experiences, and the original narrative compressed them into a single category: witnesses. That simplification helped create one of the most enduring myths in American criminal history. The number 38 became a symbol of indifference, even though the underlying evidence did not support the idea that 38 people had knowingly watched Kitty being murdered and collectively decided not to help. There were also people who did respond. Sophia Farrar went to Kitty after learning what had happened. Farrar remained with the badly injured woman and urged others to get help. That fact is essential because it demonstrates that the popular version was never the complete story. Kitty was not simply abandoned by an entire neighborhood. There was confusion, incomplete information, delayed understanding, and inadequate responses. But there was also someone who went to her. This does not eliminate every difficult question surrounding the actions of others. It simply means that the historical record cannot honestly be reduced to a story in which everyone watched and no one cared. The origin of the number itself became part of the controversy. According to the supplied account, the figure of 38 emerged from discussions between New York Times editor A.M. Rosenthal and New York City Police Commissioner Michael Murphy. Murphy reportedly indicated that approximately 38 people knew about or had heard something related to the incident. The meaning of that figure was later transformed. People who had heard something became witnesses who had supposedly watched the murder. That transformation illustrates how a small change in wording can completely alter the public understanding of a tragedy. The story became more dramatic, but it also became less accurate. In 2007, research further challenged the famous account, finding no evidence for the version in which 38 people watched the murder and refused to respond. Years later, the New York Times itself acknowledged that the 1964 report had seriously exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they actually knew. The correction was important, but it came after decades during which the original story had already become part of American culture. The myth had entered textbooks, journalism, public discussions, and psychological research. Kitty's name became associated with the bystander effect, a phenomenon studied by psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley. Their work examined how the presence of other people can influence an individual's willingness to intervene during an emergency. When many people are present, responsibility may become diffused. Individuals may look to others for cues about whether something serious is happening. If everyone appears uncertain, a person may hesitate. The phenomenon is real. But Kitty's murder should not be treated as a simple experiment proving that 38 people ignored a dying woman. The psychological lesson survived even after the factual foundation of the popular story was challenged. That is perhaps the strangest part of the Genovese legacy. A distorted account of a real murder helped inspire serious research into human behavior. The research contributed to psychology, but the historical story that inspired much of the public fascination was itself inaccurate. Kitty therefore became both a victim of violence and, unintentionally, a symbol created by journalism. The symbol sometimes overwhelmed the person. When remembering her, it is important to reverse that process. Kitty was not merely the woman 38 people failed to help. She was Catherine Susan Genovese. She was 28 years old. She lived in Kew Gardens with her friend Mary and Zelanco. She worked at a bar in Queens. On the night of March 13th, she finished her shift and drove home. She parked near the Kew Gardens station and walked toward her apartment. A man who had been looking for a woman to attack noticed her and followed. That man was Winston Moseley. He attacked Kitty, temporarily fled, returned, and killed her. Those facts are the foundation of the story. Everything else should come afterward. The tragedy is not made more meaningful by claiming that 38 people watched her die. Her death was already devastating. The truth is powerful enough. It tells us that a stranger deliberately selected a woman who was simply trying to get home. It tells us that she fought to survive. It tells us that someone eventually came to her. It tells us that the killer was arrested only 6 days later, confessed, and was connected to other serious crimes. It tells us that he was convicted, sentenced to death, had that sentence changed to life imprisonment, escaped, committed further violent offenses, and eventually died in prison. And it tells us that the story of what happened around Kitty became distorted for decades before. Journalists and researchers began correcting it. The final lesson is therefore not simply about bystanders. It is also about how society remembers victims. Real people can disappear beneath the stories created about them. A headline can become more memorable than a life. A number can become more famous than a name. A psychological concept can overshadow the person whose death helped inspire it. The responsibility of telling true crime accurately is to resist that transformation. Kitty Genovese deserves to be remembered first as a human being, not merely as a symbol. Winston Moseley deserves to be remembered as the person responsible for her murder and for other serious crimes, not as a mysterious character whose motives somehow explain away his actions. And the residents of Kew Gardens deserve to be understood through the evidence rather than through a simplified legend. Some heard, some saw fragments, some did not understand, some failed to respond adequately. And Sophia Farrar went to Kitty and stayed with her while help was summoned. That is a more complicated story than the famous headline, but it is also a more truthful one. More than 50 years after the murder, the essential facts remain unchanged. Kitty Genovese was killed on March 13, 1964. Winston Moseley was caught, convicted, and imprisoned. He died in custody in 2016. But the meaning of Kitty's story continues to evolve because the case is not only about a murderer. It is about memory, responsibility, journalism, and the danger of allowing a compelling narrative to replace evidence. Perhaps the most respectful way to remember Kitty is therefore to remove the myth and look directly at the woman beneath it. She was someone who had a home to return to, a life that existed before that night, and people who knew and cared about her. She should not be remembered only for the circumstances of her death. Yet those circumstances must be told honestly, because accuracy is one of the few things that can still be offered to someone whose life was taken so violently. The story of Kitty Genovese ends, not with the number 38, but with her name. Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese, 28 years old. Murdered by Winston Moseley on March 13, 1964. And remembered after decades of myth and correction. as a real person whose life mattered long before her death, became one of the most famous stories in American true crime.